Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a place so ordinary that most of us walk through it half asleep already. A fluorescent-lit room full of carts and conveyor belts, and 1,000 small decisions we've stopped noticing we're making. The American grocery store. Not the version you rushed through last Tuesday looking for cereal and forgetting the eggs. I mean the whole sweep of it, decades deep. From a woman in a starched dress choosing a can of soup like it was a moral decision, all the way to a person in sweatpants at 11 at night, standing in front of a wall of oat milk, quietly wondering when this became so complicated. This is the story of how a simple errand became a national mirror, reflecting back everything Americans believed about themselves, their families, their money, and their bodies, one shopping trip at a time. Before we go further, get yourself settled. Turn the lights down, let your shoulders drop, get horizontal if you haven't already. This is a long one tonight, built to wander, built to blur, built to be the kind of story that's still playing quietly in the background long after you've drifted off. There's no test at the end. There's nothing to remember. Just let it wash over you. Have you ever really thought about what it took to feed a family in America 100 years ago, before a single building could hold everything you needed? Have you wondered why a trip to buy potatoes once required a hat and a good pair of gloves? Why entire industries decided, at some specific and traceable moment, that the correct response to any nutritional fear was to invent a new box with fewer calories and a worse flavor? Why the freezer went from a small drawer of ice cubes to an entire wing of the store? And how, somewhere between your grandmother's girdle and your own sweatpants, an errand that used to require armor became something you could do without changing out of the clothes you slept in. Let's find out together. Let's go shopping. Picture, for a moment, an American kitchen at the very start of the 20th century. There is no single store that sells everything a household needs. Instead, there is a small constellation of shops, each one specialized, each one run by someone who has known your family for years. The butcher cuts your meat to order and remembers that your husband prefers his roasts a certain way. The greengrocer sets aside the good tomatoes before they even reach the display. The dry goods store measures flour and sugar out of barrels, weighing them by hand. The dairyman delivers milk to your doorstep before dawn, the glass bottles sweating in the summer heat. Buying food was not a single errand. It was a network of relationships, and it took most of a morning, sometimes most of a day, depending on how far apart the shops were and how much conversation each stop required, because conversation was, in a very real sense, part of the transaction. This system worked in its way. It built loyalty. It built trust. It also built dependency because the shopkeeper controlled the inventory and the customer controlled almost nothing. You handed over your list, or you spoke your needs aloud, and a clerk vanished into a back room to assemble your order out of your sight. You didn't choose your apples. Someone chose them for you. You didn't compare 3 brands of flour side by side. There was one flour, the flour the store carried, and you bought it or you went elsewhere and started the whole ritual over again. Then, in 1916, in Memphis, Tennessee, a man named Clarence Saunders decided this entire arrangement was backwards. He opened a store called Piggly Wiggly, an unusual name for what would turn out to be an unusually important idea. Saunders proposed something that sounds almost too simple to matter now, but at the time was close to radical. Let the customers walk the aisles themselves. Let them pick up the cans, read the labels, compare the prices, and decide for themselves what went into the basket. No clerk standing between the shopper and the shelf. No invisible back room where decisions were made on your behalf. Just you, a basket, and the freedom to wander. It is difficult to overstate how strange this seemed to people at the time. Some early visitors to Piggly Wiggly reportedly didn't understand they were allowed to touch the products, standing awkwardly near the shelves until an employee explained that yes, this was the whole point, please help yourself. But it did not take long for Americans to discover that they were, in fact, extremely good at helping themselves. The basket got heavier. The heavier basket needed wheels. And so, within a couple of decades, the entire architecture of American shopping had begun reorganizing itself around a single, quietly enormous idea. That abundance, once you let people see all of it at once, sells itself. By the 1930s, a new kind of store had appeared, larger and blunter than anything Saunders had built. In Queens, New York, a former grocery employee named Michael Cullen opened a store in a converted garage and called it King Cullen. He had pitched his concept to his employer years earlier and been turned down flat, so he went and built it himself. A massive no-frills operation stacked to the ceiling with goods, selling everything under one roof at prices lower than any specialty shop could manage. The idea was crude by later standards. Concrete floors, exposed shelving, nothing decorative, nothing warm. But it worked spectacularly because the timing was perfect. The country was in the middle of the Great Depression, and Americans of every background had become suddenly, urgently focused on price in a way they had never needed to be before. Warmth didn't matter. A clerk who remembered your name didn't matter. What mattered was whether a loaf of bread cost a few cents less than it did at the shop down the road, and King Cullen and the wave of imitators that followed it understood that completely. The war years slowed everything down, as war years tend to, but what came after the war was an explosion. Soldiers came home, married, had children, and moved, in astonishing numbers, into brand new suburban developments that hadn't existed 5 years earlier. These new neighborhoods needed stores, and the stores that thrived were the big ones, the supermarkets, because a family settling into a new house on a new street with new neighbors needed to fill a kitchen fast, and the supermarket, with its long aisles and towering shelves, was built for exactly that kind of need. By the middle of the 1950s, the average American supermarket had grown to roughly 10,000 square feet. Give it 20 more years, and that number had doubled. Give it a few decades more, and stores were routinely crossing 60,000 square feet, folding in pharmacies, florists, small bank branches, and hot food counters, until the grocery store stopped being a place you visited for one thing and became a place where, in theory, an entire Saturday could simply disappear, but something else was happening underneath all that square footage, something quieter and much harder to measure. When you can see every option laid out in front of you at once, when 100 different brands of the same basic product are all fighting for your eye at the same time, your relationship with food itself starts to shift. You stop simply buying what you need. You start noticing what you didn't know you wanted. You pick up a can you've never tried because it happened to be at eye level, and the label was a color that caught your attention. The supermarket did not just change where Americans shopped. It changed what Americans believed they were entitled to want, and once that door opened, it never really closed again. Let's talk about what it actually felt like to walk into one of these stores in 1955, because it is almost impossible to overstate how different the emotional stakes were. For the woman doing the shopping, and it was, overwhelmingly, women doing this particular kind of shopping, this was not a chore squeezed in between errands. It was closer to a public appearance, something you prepared for the way you might prepare for a visit from in-laws. You put on a proper dress. You did your hair. You checked your reflection before you left the house, because the grocery store was not merely a place to acquire food. It was a stage, and everyone on it was being watched, and everyone doing the watching was also, at the very same moment, being watched themselves. The unspoken rules were strict, even if nobody wrote them down anywhere. Buying the name brand over the store brand signaled that your household had money enough not to worry, or at least money enough to appear not to worry, which in some ways mattered more. Choosing the right cut of meat signaled competence, an understanding of your family's needs, and your husband's preferences that had been carefully built up over years of practice. A soft tomato or a wilting head of lettuce in your cart wasn't just a bad purchase. It was evidence, visible evidence, that might make its way onto your dinner table that very night and be silently judged by the people eating it. Getting dressed for the grocery store, then, was not vanity. It was armor, and it was also, in its strange way, a kind of dignity, a refusal to let a routine task go unmarked. Consider the shopping cart itself for a moment, because it is easy to walk past something so familiar without ever asking where it came from. The cart, as we know it, was invented in 1937 by a supermarket owner in Oklahoma City named Sylvan Goldman. Goldman had noticed a frustrating pattern. Customers would fill their hand baskets until the wait became uncomfortable, and then, rather than continue shopping, they would simply stop, pay for what they had, and leave, even if they'd intended to buy more. Goldman's solution was elegant. What if the basket had wheels? What if it could carry far more weight than any human arm could manage? The early carts were clunky, awkward metal frames, and the public's first reaction was not enthusiasm but suspicion. Men reportedly found them embarrassing to push, feeling the carts made them look weak or overly domestic. Women, meanwhile, associated the design with baby carriages and wanted nothing to do with something that made a grocery trip resemble a stroll with an infant. Goldman's solution to this resistance is one of the odder footnotes in American retail history. He hired actors, paid actors, to walk through his stores pushing the carts around casually, normalizing the sight for real customers who were watching from the aisles. It worked. Within roughly a decade, the cart had become standard equipment in stores across the country, and by the 1950s it had transformed into something more than a container. It had become an extension of the housewife's identity, filled with intention, arranged with care, pushed with the quiet confidence of a woman who had a plan for the week and was not going to be caught without one. The social dynamics playing out in those aisles were subtle but constant, a low hum of observation running underneath every trip. Women noticed what other women placed in their carts. There was quiet judgment about brand choices, about portion sizes, about whether reaching for a convenience item signaled modern efficiency, or less charitably, a shortcut taken by someone who wasn't quite managing. And nowhere was this more concentrated than at the checkout line, where every item in your cart was laid out on the conveyor belt for anyone standing nearby to see. A brief, involuntary autobiography of your household's habits, tastes, and by extension, its worth. And yet, for all the pressure, it would be a mistake to describe this era purely as one of constraint and performance. Many women who lived through it genuinely loved the grocery store, in a way that can be hard to fully explain from where we're standing now. It represented mastery. It represented the accumulation of real, hard-won expertise, knowing exactly which day the store restocked its produce, knowing precisely how many pounds of ground beef would stretch across a week of dinners for a family of 5, knowing the store's entire floor plan well enough to move through it with total efficiency. The woman who could do all of this smoothly, stylishly, without visible effort, was not merely performing a role assigned to her. Within the narrow vocabulary her era gave her to describe success, she was genuinely, demonstrably excellent at something difficult. The job was constraining. The job was, by any modern measure, unfairly narrow. But inside the pressed dress and the carefully chosen cart of groceries was a real and considerable skill, one that would take decades to fully separate from the system that had demanded it in the first place. Now let's step back and look at the building itself, because the supermarket you walked into in 1955 or walk into tonight was never simply a room full of shelves arranged by accident. It was, and still is, one of the most carefully engineered retail environments ever designed, built specifically to shape your behavior using nothing more than layout, lighting, scent, and sound. Start with where you enter. In almost every supermarket you have ever visited, the produce section greets you first, positioned right at the entrance. This is not because fruits and vegetables are the most profitable items in the store. They are, in fact, often among the least profitable, subject to spoilage and thin margins. They are placed at the front because they are colorful, because they smell alive, because walking past a wall of bright, fresh produce puts a shopper into a specific frame of mind before they've bought a single thing. Virtuous, optimistic, and quietly convinced that because the trip started with something healthy, whatever ends up in the cart later has been, in some small sense, earned. Milk and eggs, meanwhile, sit at the very back of nearly every store in the country, and this placement is no accident either. These are staples, Almost every household needs them on almost every trip, which means the store can be certain that most shoppers will walk the entire length of the building to reach them. Every aisle along that long walk becomes an opportunity. Every end cap display becomes a small, quiet ambush waiting for a shopper who came in for milk and is leaving with considerably more. Then there is the bread. In most stores, the bakery sits somewhere in the middle of the building, and the reasoning behind that placement is almost embarrassingly simple once you know it. The smell of fresh baking is one of the most powerful purchase triggers that retail science has ever identified. Stores did not begin installing in-house bakeries primarily because customers were clamoring for fresher bread. They installed them because the smell diffuses outward through the aisles, making shoppers hungry, and hungry shoppers buy more of everything, not just bread. Even the music playing quietly overhead was the subject of serious study. Researchers found, and a widely cited study published in the Journal of Marketing in the early 1980s confirmed, that slow-tempo music causes shoppers to physically move more slowly through a store, and shoppers who move slowly spend more money. Faster music has the opposite effect, hurrying people along and shrinking their final total. If the background music in your local grocery store has always struck you as strangely sedate, a little too unhurried to be anyone's actual taste, that's because it was never chosen for your enjoyment. It was chosen to cost you 3 or 4 extra minutes per aisle, minutes that, multiplied across an entire shopping trip, add up to real money. The end cap displays, those shelves positioned at the end of each aisle, are some of the most valuable real estate in the entire building, and food companies pay considerable sums to occupy them, because products place their sell dramatically better, not because they're cheaper or superior, but simply because they're visible in a way that products buried mid-aisle are not. Eye-level shelving works on the same principle. The products sitting directly at your eye line are, more often than not, the products whose manufacturers paid extra for that exact positioning, while the often equally good, often cheaper store brand alternative waits patiently on the bottom shelf, requiring you to bend down, which feels like a small effort most people would rather avoid. And the store has learned, correctly, that many of us will pay a little more simply to skip the crouching. None of this makes the modern grocery store sinister. Exactly. It makes it legible, once you know where to look. Once you understand that you are walking through a space that has been meticulously designed around the predictable patterns of human psychology, the whole experience shifts. It stops being a neutral errand and starts to feel like something almost impressively intricate, a building that has thought harder about your habits than most people in your life ever have. The least you can do, the next time you catch that bread smell drifting down an aisle, is notice it, and maybe give it a small nod of appreciation for the craftsmanship involved. Now, let's talk about something genuinely strange, something that requires no exaggeration at all to sound unbelievable to modern ears. The gelatin salad. There is no gentle way to introduce this topic, so let's just say it plainly. At the height of its popularity, roughly from 1950 through the mid-1960s, American women were suspending vegetables, fruit, seafood, and occasionally all three together, inside brightly colored, flavored gelatin, and serving the results at dinner parties with genuine pride. Lime gelatin studded with shredded carrots, tomato aspic dotted with olives that seemed to stare back at you from inside the mold. These dishes were not considered strange at the time. They were considered impressive, a sign of a hostess who had planned ahead, who understood presentation, who could produce something visually dramatic using nothing but a box of powder and a refrigerator. Gelatin desserts themselves were not new to this era. The commercial product had existed since 1897, when a man named Pearl Waite registered a fruit-flavored gelatin powder, and as the story goes, his wife suggested the brand name that would eventually become a household word. Waite, lacking the patience or the capital to build the business further, sold the entire operation only a couple of years later for a sum that history has generally judged to be one of the worst business decisions of its era. But under new ownership, the product found its footing, marketed aggressively through free recipe booklets, magazine advertisements, and door-to-door demonstrations that placed the product directly into the hands and kitchens of American housewives. It was the post-war kitchen, though, that turned gelatin into a genuine cultural phenomenon. Reliable home refrigeration had become standard, packaged goods filled the pantry, and an entire generation of women had both the time and the social incentive to impress. The gelatin mold suited this moment perfectly. It required planning, since it had to be prepared well in advance and chilled for hours, which demonstrated forethought and competence. It arrived at the table with genuine visual drama, holding its improbable shape through what felt, to a dinner guest, like something close to sorcery. And it could contain almost anything, which meant it could be endlessly adapted to holidays, seasons, and budgets. Cookbooks from this era, read today, feel almost like they were written by a different species. Savory gelatin salads were everywhere. Tomato aspic, chicken suspended in clear consommé, rings of cream cheese, and olives. Perhaps the most famous of all was something called perfection salad, a dish that won a national recipe contest in 1905 and was, by all accounts, considered by its creator to be a genuine culinary achievement. It combined cabbage, celery, and red pepper suspended in a lemon-flavored gelatin base, and it was served, without irony, at respectable dinner parties, where guests reportedly asked for the recipe. The company behind the leading gelatin brand understood exactly what was happening and leaned into it with real enthusiasm, releasing new flavors and increasingly ambitious recipe booklets throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. One booklet from the mid-1960s includes a recipe for a tomato-flavored gelatin ring built specifically to surround a filling of tuna salad, described in the accompanying text as a refreshing dish for a summer luncheon. Technically, that description is not wrong. It is also, by any standard available to us now, a fairly clear cry for help. The decline, when it came, was gradual at first and then fairly sudden. By the 1970s, the molded gelatin dish had begun its long retreat, a casualty of shifting tastes, growing culinary sophistication, and a dawning realization among many younger women that their mother's generation of cooking had perhaps been just a little unusual. A new kind of televised cooking instruction had entered American living rooms by then, one that treated food as something to be understood and enjoyed rather than simply assembled and presented, and the idea that a meal should actually taste like the ingredients it was made from was steadily gaining ground. The gelatin mold never fully vanished. It survived for decades in church basements and family holiday tables long after it had lost its place at the center of the aspirational dinner party. But it lost its status entirely, and what it left behind is genuinely useful as a piece of evidence. The molded gelatin dish tells us, with unusual clarity, exactly what American food culture prized at that moment in history: novelty, presentation, control, and the almost magical transformation of a box of powder into something that gleamed under the dining room light. Let's talk for a while about the can. If the 1950s housewife had a single most loyal companion in the kitchen, it was not her husband, and it was not her neighbor. It was her can opener. Canned food had existed in America since the Civil War era, but by the middle of the 20th century, it had been thoroughly rehabilitated, transformed from a wartime necessity into a proud symbol of modern efficiency and domestic preparedness. A pantry lined with familiar red and white labels was not evidence of laziness. It was evidence that you were capable, organized, and forward-thinking, a woman who understood exactly how to keep her family fed regardless of what the week might bring. Opening a can was not cheating. In the vocabulary of the era, it was practically a form of science, and combining 3 or 4 different cans into a single casserole dish approached something like domestic art. The technology of canning itself is far older than the American supermarket, tracing back to a very specific and very practical military problem. Napoleon Bonaparte, needing a way to keep his armies fed while on campaign, offered a substantial cash prize to anyone who could solve the problem of preserving food for long periods without spoilage. A Frenchman named Nicolas Appert claimed the prize in 1810, using a method of sealing food inside glass jars and heating them, a technique that predates the metal tin can by only a handful of years. The earliest cans were heavy, awkward, and sealed with such determination that opening one safely required tools closer to a hammer and chisel than anything resembling a modern kitchen gadget. Some early can labels reportedly suggested using a bayonet to force them open, which tells you something about who these early cans were designed for, and it certainly wasn't the home cook. By the 20th century, the technology had matured considerably. Cans had become lighter, seals had become standardized and far safer, and the electric can opener, introduced commercially in the 1930s, turned what had once been a genuine physical task into something you could accomplish one-handed while glancing at a recipe. The contents inside had improved as well. One particular soup company, which had introduced its condensed soup line back in 1897 and printed its now iconic red and white label around the turn of the century, had by the 1950s become one of the most instantly recognizable brands in the entire country. So recognizable that a prominent American artist would famously paint its cans just over a decade later as a pointed comment on the nature of consumer culture itself. But to the housewife stocking her shelves, none of that mattered. She wasn't thinking about art. She was thinking about dinner. The stocked pantry carried an emotional weight that went well beyond its practical function. In the same way earlier generations of American women had once preserved their own vegetables and fruit each summer to guard against winter scarcity, the mid-century housewife stocked her shelves with canned goods as a kind of security blanket, a hedge against uncertainty, whether that uncertainty came from bad weather, a tight week financially, or simply an empty market. A full shelf meant her family could eat no matter what happened outside the front door. It was abundance rendered shelf-stable, something you could see and count and rely on. Nowhere was the canned goods era better expressed than in the casserole. The most famous example, a simple dish built from a can of cream of mushroom soup, a can of French-style green beans, and crispy fried onions scattered across the top, was created in 1955 by a home economist working for a major soup company. It took roughly 10 minutes to assemble, required no real cooking skill, and within a decade had become one of the single most frequently prepared dishes in the entire country, a status it has never really relinquished, still appearing on Thanksgiving tables today with a kind of stubborn, unkillable consistency that seems to exist independently of whether anyone actually loves the dish itself. Cream of mushroom soup, in particular, became something close to a foundational ingredient in mid-century American cooking, a base for sauces, casseroles, gravies, and fillings of every description. It was thick, savory, endlessly shelf-stable, and available in every store in the country, and generations of American home cooks learned to build entire meals around it, the way earlier generations had once learned to build meals around a proper roux. It wasn't treated as a shortcut. It was treated as a foundation, something a recipe simply assumed you already had in your cupboard. There is something genuinely touching, viewed from this distance, about the canned goods era as a whole. It represented a kind of compact between the American food industry and the American housewife. We will make this easy, and you will make it good. The results were sometimes strange, often deeply comforting, and almost always, whatever their nutritional shortcomings, entirely edible. The can opener hanging on the wall was the key to a very specific, now largely vanished, form of domestic confidence, and a full, organized pantry was a quiet, unspoken declaration to anyone who opened the cupboard door. This household is provided for, and I know exactly where I keep the soup. There is a particular kind of American evening that didn't exist before 1953, and once it existed, it changed something fundamental about how families organized their time together. Picture a living room, the television glowing in the corner, still a relatively new fixture in most homes, still something people arranged their furniture around with a kind of reverence. And picture, resting on a small folding tray in front of that television, a segmented aluminum tray divided into neat little compartments, each one holding something different. Sliced turkey in one corner, cornbread dressing in another, a small mound of sweet potatoes, a modest scoop of peas, slightly wrinkled from their time in the freezer. This was the frozen dinner, and its arrival quietly, politely, and permanently rearranged the American relationship with the evening meal. The story of how this tray came to exist is usually told as a happy accident, and depending on which food historian you ask, it may or may not be entirely accurate, but it's a good story regardless, and it captures something true about the era even if some of the details have been smoothed over with retelling. As the story goes, a major frozen food company had badly overestimated how much turkey Americans would want in the aftermath of Thanksgiving in 1953, and found itself sitting on an enormous surplus, reportedly hundreds of tons of frozen turkey, with nowhere obvious to send it. A salesman at the company, whose exact role in the invention is still debated by historians today, is credited with suggesting that the surplus turkey, along with some appropriate side dishes, be divided into individual compartments on an aluminum tray, a design reportedly inspired by the divided trays used to serve meals on early commercial airline flights. The company packed these trays in dry ice, shipped them to a handful of test markets, priced them under $1, and gave them a name built entirely around the object that was, at that exact cultural moment, the single most exciting piece of furniture in the American living room, the television set. The gamble paid off almost immediately. Within the first year, tens of millions of these trays were sold, and whatever financial problem the surplus turkey had created was solved many times over. But the deeper significance of the product had very little to do with turkey inventory management. It had to do with permission. The television dinner did something no previous food product had quite managed. It gave American families explicit, packaged, ready-made permission to eat somewhere other than the dining table, at a time other than the traditional dinner hour, in a posture other than sitting formally across from one another with proper table settings and expected conversation. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand what the dinner table had represented up until that point. It was not simply furniture where food happened to be placed. It was, in the cultural imagination of the era, close to an institution. Etiquette books devoted entire chapters to the proper conduct of a family meal. Women's magazines ran articles instructing readers on how to set a table correctly, how to structure a satisfying menu, how to use dinner as an opportunity to reinforce family cohesion after a day spent apart. Mothers enforced the ritual of the shared table with real conviction, operating on a widely shared belief that families who ate together regularly were, in some measurable way, closer, healthier, and more intact than families who did not. The television, arriving in American homes throughout the early 1950s in astonishing numbers, had already begun quietly reorganizing domestic schedules around broadcast times, and families who had once eaten together at a fixed hour out of habit were now, increasingly, negotiating around what program was airing at what time. The frozen dinner did not create this tension. It simply noticed the tension was already there and offered a remarkably convenient solution. By making a complete meal that required no real preparation, no serving dishes beyond the tray it arrived in, and no cleanup beyond throwing that same tray away, the product made eating in front of a television screen not just acceptable but, in a strange way, logical. The tray itself even folded outward slightly, forming a makeshift little table, a detail that suggests the manufacturer had anticipated exactly how and where this meal was going to be consumed. It is worth being honest about the eating experience itself, because it was not, by most accounts, particularly good. The turkey tended to dry out during the reheating process. The potatoes achieved a density that seemed less like a side dish and more like a structural material. And the peas, having survived a freezing process and then an oven reheating process, arrived at the table with a texture that is genuinely difficult to describe without a certain amount of hand-waving. But none of this mattered nearly as much as the underlying proposition being sold, which had very little to do with flavor. The proposition was simple. You do not have to stop what you are doing in order to eat. Eating can happen alongside other things. Eating does not have to be the main event of the evening. This was, in its own quiet way, a genuinely significant cultural shift, even if nobody at the time would have described it in those terms. The American family meal had been formally positioned, for generations, as a moment of gathering, of nutritional restoration and of social cohesion, all happening simultaneously around a shared table. The frozen dinner offered an alternative, and enough American households accepted that alternative, again and again, week after week, to make it one of the most commercially successful food products of the entire century. The table itself did not disappear. Families still gathered around it, still do, on plenty of evenings even now. But after the arrival of that little aluminum tray, the dinner table was never again quite as mandatory as it had once seemed. Now, let's talk about a shift that took much longer to unfold, but ended up reshaping American eating just as thoroughly, if not more so. Somewhere in the years spanning the 1960s and 1970s, a quiet transformation occurred in how Americans thought about the very concept of a quick meal. In the early decades of the century, preparing something fast, something that skipped the usual steps of careful, from-scratch cooking, was the kind of thing you apologized for, almost defensively, if a guest happened to notice. By the middle of the century's second half, a fast meal had become something entirely different. It had become something you could mention proudly, almost as a small badge of modern efficiency. To understand why this happened, you have to look honestly at what daily life actually looked like for American women during these decades. Because the shift in food culture cannot be separated from the shift in who was cooking and under what conditions. The idealized image of the full-time housewife, devoted entirely to home and family, had reached something close to its cultural peak in the 1950s. But by the 1960s, and increasingly through the 1970s, growing numbers of American women were entering paid employment outside the home. Sometimes this was a matter of personal choice and ambition. Often and increasingly, it was a matter of economic necessity, as household budgets stretched thinner and a single income became harder to rely on. And running alongside both of these forces was a broader cultural reckoning, sparked in large part by a wave of published writing examining the limits and frustrations of a life organized entirely around domestic duty, a reckoning that led a significant number of women to question, publicly and often for the first time, whether a life centered exclusively on the home had ever been the whole and complete answer it had been presented as. Whatever the cause, the practical result was the same. Women were working, often full days, and in the vast majority of households they were also still expected to handle the majority of the cooking once they returned home. This was not a brand new phenomenon exactly, but it was becoming newly visible, newly discussed, and for the women actually living it, newly and undeniably exhausting. Into this exhaustion, the American convenience food industry arrived with what felt, to many households, like a genuine gift. A boxed dinner kit launched in 1971 promised a complete meal built around ground beef, a packet of pre-measured seasoning, and a packet of pasta, all finished in about half an hour. The marketing behind the product reportedly leaned on the idea that a busy cook only needed one free hand to manage the whole process, a small but telling detail about who the product was actually designed for. It was not, by any measure, a nutritionally sophisticated meal. But to a tired parent standing in a kitchen at 6 in the evening with hungry children circling nearby, it was close to a small miracle. By the middle of the decade, it had become one of the best-selling products in American grocery stores, sitting in pantries that stretched from dense suburban developments in the Northeast to small rural households across the Midwest, offering every single one of them the exact same quiet promise: dinner without the drama. The broader category of instant and convenience foods expanded rapidly throughout this same period. Instant oatmeal, which had technically existed in some form since the 1940s, found renewed commercial success through individually flavored single-serving packets, sweetened with maple flavoring or artificial fruit essence. Instant mashed potatoes, introduced by a major food manufacturer in 1965, invited the home cook to boil water, stir in a powder, and produce something reasonably potato-adjacent in under 5 minutes. No peeling, no boiling, no mashing required. Instant ramen noodles, imported originally from Japan and gradually adapted to fit American tastes and packaging conventions, arrived in the mid-1970s and became an enduring staple of college dormitories and budget-conscious households, a loyalty that, remarkably, has never really faded. It would be easy, and it was certainly done at the time, to describe all of this as simple laziness, a generational shortcut taken by people who had lost interest in proper cooking. But this framing misses something important, and it is worth sitting with the honest math for a moment. Preparing a meal entirely from scratch takes, on average, somewhere between 30 minutes and several hours, depending heavily on what is being made and how much preparation was done in advance. A convenience meal, by contrast, typically takes 10 to 20 minutes and demands dramatically less mental effort. There is no recipe to consult, no multiple components requiring coordination, no juggling of timing across several pots on a crowded stove. And when you are tired, genuinely tired after 8 hours of paid work, with children who need attention, laundry that needs doing, and something beeping insistently from another room, that reduction in mental effort is not a trivial or frivolous consideration. It is, for a great many households, the entire difference between a manageable evening and an overwhelming one. The American grocery store adjusted itself to this shift in real time, and you can trace the change almost aisle by aisle across these decades. Shelf space expanded steadily for convenience products. The frozen section grew larger with each passing year. Entire new aisles emerged, dedicated specifically to boxed and packaged meal solutions that had not existed in any meaningful volume a generation earlier. Speed itself became an explicit selling point, printed directly on packaging in bold, confident type. Ready in 5 minutes, just add water, dinner on the table in 20. The word easy appeared on food packaging with such relentless frequency during this era that it eventually became almost invisible, less a distinguishing feature and more a baseline expectation that every competing product needed to meet or lose ground. By the 1980s, easy alone was no longer sufficient. It had to be fast as well, and increasingly, it had to be fast in a very specific, very measurable sense, counted out loud in minutes on the packaging itself. Nobody made a formal announcement that speed had won this particular cultural contest. It simply happened, gradually at first and then almost completely, until speed had become the unspoken organizing principle behind the American weeknight meal, so thoroughly absorbed into daily life that cooking something slowly, something that demanded real time and real attention, had shifted categories entirely. It was no longer simply dinner. It had become a hobby, a deliberate choice reserved for weekends, for people who happened to have time on their hands. Dinner, on an ordinary Tuesday, was the 20-minute version, and the grocery store, stocked from end to end with exactly that 20-minute version, made absolutely certain that no household would ever have to go without it. Let's shift now to something a little different, something less about speed and more about identity, because brand loyalty in mid-century America deserves real attention on its own terms. Ask an American shopper in 1960 which brand of mayonnaise they preferred, and you would likely see something close to genuine passion in their response, the same particular intensity usually reserved for conversations about sports rivalries or long-standing neighborhood grudges. Certain condiment rivalries in particular became deeply, almost comically entrenched. This was not casual preference. This was identity, inherited from parents, defended in ordinary conversation, and maintained with a level of stubborn consistency that would have impressed a medieval knight sworn to a particular banner. The psychology underlying this kind of loyalty is not especially complicated, but it runs remarkably deep. Human beings are, by nature, pattern-following creatures who find genuine comfort in repetition, and few areas of daily life are as repetition-dependent as food. You grew up eating whatever your parents happened to buy, and your palate calibrated itself, quietly and permanently, to those exact specific flavors. The particular sweetness of one brand's ketchup, the particular saltiness of another brand's crackers. That early calibration then spent the rest of your life functioning as your personal definition of correct. Switching brands as an adult wasn't experienced as simply trying something new. It registered, on some deep and largely unconscious level, as a minor betrayal of a sensory baseline you had been quietly building since early childhood. The unfamiliar brand tasted wrong, not because it was objectively worse in any measurable way, but because it wasn't the one you had grown up with, and the one you had grown up with was, by definition in your own mind, the right one. Food companies understood this dynamic with real clarity, and they invested heavily and early in establishing brand identities that would take root before a consumer was even old enough to make independent purchasing decisions. The soup company mentioned earlier had been advertising steadily in women's magazines since the early 1900s, building a visual identity so deeply embedded in the national consciousness that by mid-century, its red and white label had become one of the most instantly recognizable images in the entire country. Rival cereal companies competed not merely on the quality or nutritional content of their products, but on something closer to nostalgia itself, whose box had been sitting on your family's breakfast table when you were 7 years old. That was the box you would likely buy for your own children decades later, and they, in turn, would likely buy it for theirs, a form of loyalty that reproduced itself quietly across generations without requiring a single additional advertising dollar. Few rivalries captured this dynamic more vividly than the long-standing division between two competing brands of mayonnaise, a rivalry so firmly entrenched and so emotionally loaded that, according to more than a few family anecdotes passed down over the years, it has occasionally functioned as an informal compatibility test in new relationships. One brand, introduced by a major food company in 1933 as a cheaper, sweeter alternative to traditional mayonnaise, found enormous popularity across the Midwest and the South. Its rival, with a cleaner and more traditional flavor profile, dominated the Northeast and much of the West Coast. The two products occupied nearly identical shelf space, served nearly identical culinary functions, and yet inspired a level of passionate, defended loyalty that bears essentially no rational relationship to the actual differences between two jars of emulsified oil and egg. People had genuine opinions about this, and many still do, and they were, and are, entirely willing to defend those opinions at length. Supermarkets, for their part, learned to take quiet advantage of all of this entrenched loyalty. Store layouts deliberately placed rival brands directly beside one another on the shelf, allowing existing customer devotion to do the persuasive work without any additional effort from the store itself, while the house brand equivalent waited nearby, positioned slightly lower on the shelf, priced a bit cheaper, patiently available for the customer whose brand loyalty, it turned out, had a firm price ceiling after all. The rise of the private label generic product across these decades was, in many ways, a slow and careful campaign to establish a simple market truth. Some shoppers cared deeply about the name printed on the package, and other shoppers cared considerably more about the number printed on the price tag, and there was real money to be made serving both groups simultaneously, often from the very same shelf. What is genuinely interesting, looking back at all of this from where we stand now, is just how completely the mid-century brand landscape has since fractured apart. The grocery store that once offered a fairly small, manageable handful of trusted options within any given product category now offers dozens, sometimes hundreds, each one competing for a form of loyalty that has grown noticeably thinner and far more conditional than it once was. The kind of brand relationship that once reasonably lasted an entire lifetime now often lasts only until a product receives an unflattering review online, or until its price creeps up past what a shopper considers reasonable. You can still, even today, find people willing to passionately defend their preferred brand of mayonnaise. But that argument becomes considerably harder to sustain with real conviction when there happen to be 19 other jars sitting on the very same shelf, and at least 3 of them are proudly labeled as locally sourced. By the early 1960s, something had begun to shift in American kitchens, slowly at first, and not without real resistance from multiple directions. Women who had spent the better part of a decade perfecting their gelatin molds and refining their casserole ratios were beginning, in growing numbers, to ask harder questions about the whole system surrounding them. A widely discussed book published in 1963 examined the deep frustrations simmering beneath the surface of the idealized American housewife role, and while the book itself was not, strictly speaking, about cooking or grocery shopping, its central question rippled outward with real force, moving from the living room, where it was first debated, into the kitchen, and eventually, in its own quiet way, all the way down the cereal aisle. It is important to be careful and precise about what this shift actually represented, because it is not, in any simple sense, a story about feminism liberating women from the burden of cooking, as though cooking itself had simply been oppression waiting to be escaped. Many of the women asking these harder questions throughout the 1960s genuinely loved to cook. They were skilled at it, often deeply proud of it, having built real, substantial expertise across years of daily hands-on practice. What they were beginning to question was not the cooking itself, but the rigid frame surrounding it, the deeply held assumption that cooking and domestic labor more broadly represented the entire sum of a woman's ambition, the absolute ceiling of her potential, and the primary, almost exclusive standard by which she would be evaluated as a person. The kitchen itself was never really the underlying problem. The mandatory, all-encompassing nature of it was, around this same time. In 1963, an American public television program introduced audiences to a new kind of cooking instructor, a woman who approached French cuisine with genuine warmth, curiosity, and an evident sense of joy. And while she was not, by any explicit measure, a political figure or an outspoken feminist voice, she nonetheless did something that, in its own quiet way, was genuinely radical for its time. She treated cooking as a craft worth understanding deeply, as a source of real pleasure, rather than simply a duty to be dutifully executed and never questioned. She made visible mistakes on camera and laughed them off without embarrassment. She explained not just the mechanical steps of a recipe, but the underlying reasons certain techniques worked the way they did. She spoke about food with real intellectual curiosity and evident physical delight, and she noticeably did not treat the kitchen as a space defined primarily by obligation. For a great many American women watching at home, seeing their own daily labor treated with this kind of genuine interest and respect was something entirely new. The cookbook market itself began shifting noticeably during this same decade. Where post-war cookbooks had organized themselves almost entirely around efficiency, practicality, and the reliable, competent performance of domestic duty, cookbooks published in the 1960s increasingly made room for pleasure, for genuine exploration, and even for acknowledged difficulty. A landmark cookbook published in 1961, built around the serious, careful mastery of French cooking technique, ran to roughly 400 pages and represented a substantial commitment for any reader willing to work through it properly. It assumed its reader genuinely wanted to understand the underlying craft, not simply follow instructions blindly. It assumed the reader had both the time and the patience required to attempt something as fussy and demanding as a proper butter sauce. This was, in a fairly meaningful way, a different set of assumptions than the ones baked into the efficient, no-nonsense casserole cookbooks of the previous decade. Meanwhile, the grocery store itself was adjusting to pressures that were partly demographic and partly quietly political. As more women entered the paid workforce, shopping habits shifted accordingly, favoring less time spent in the store and a stronger interest in genuine convenience. But among a rapidly growing, college-educated demographic, there was also a rising interest in quality and variety for its own sake. Specialty items began appearing on grocery shelves that would have seemed entirely out of place a decade earlier. Imported cheeses, olive oils that weren't simply generic blends, wine sold not in oversized jugs but in proper individual bottles. The idea that a grocery store might reasonably carry products beyond the standard American mainstream was genuinely new, and its gradual arrival on shelves represented a quiet but real acknowledgement that shopper expectations were beginning to diversify in ways the industry hadn't fully anticipated. At the same time, broader public conversations about school lunch programs, food assistance policy, and the very earliest stirrings of the environmental movement were beginning to introduce entirely new questions into the national conversation about food, where exactly it came from, and what precisely it contained. A widely read book published in 1962, focused primarily on the ecological dangers of pesticide use, planted a seed of genuine consumer skepticism toward industrial food production that would continue growing steadily across the following decades. If chemical companies were capable of causing serious, measurable harm to the surrounding environment, what exactly might they also be doing, quietly and invisibly, to the food supply itself? The question did not produce any immediate measurable commercial consequences, but it was being asked, seriously and repeatedly, and simply being asked was enough to plant something that would not go away. The American kitchen of the 1960s, then, was a room caught genuinely in transition. Still, in most households, largely defined as the woman's domain, still organized around its traditional core function, but increasingly inhabited by women who were beginning to think about that space differently, as a place of real skill and genuine pleasure pursued on their own terms, rather than simply the fixed location where an assumed domestic obligation was quietly discharged, day after day, without much question. The grocery store itself, walking through it at the very end of that decade, looked almost identical to the one that had stood there at its beginning. But the person pushing the cart through it had, in ways both subtle and significant, changed. The 1970s did not arrive gently in the American kitchen. They arrived with a strange, contradictory energy, a decade that somehow managed to be both wildly indulgent and quietly anxious at the very same time, often within the very same meal. This was the decade of the fondue pot proudly displayed on the good tablecloth, and the box pasta dinner quietly reheated on a Tuesday when nobody had the energy for anything more ambitious. It was the decade of casseroles built from a can of soup that had likely been sitting in the back of the pantry since some earlier, half-forgotten presidential administration. And underneath all of it, running like a persistent low hum, it was the decade of the very first great national nutritional panic, when Americans woke up, almost collectively, to the unsettling realization that certain foods they had trusted without question for their entire lives might, in fact, be quietly killing them. It would be unfair, though, to describe the 1970s purely as a decade of decline, because some of what happened in American kitchens during these years came from a place of genuine warmth and enthusiasm rather than anxiety. This was, notably, a decade with a real appetite for entertaining, for the small theater of hosting a dinner party, for treating an evening with friends as something worth some genuine ceremony. Fondue, which had arrived from Switzerland in the final years of the previous decade, reached its full cultural peak in the early 1970s, and not merely as a cheese-based dish. Oil fondue became popular for cooking bite-sized pieces of meat right at the table. Chocolate fondue turned dessert into a shared, communal activity. The fondue pot itself, sitting proudly at the center of a dinner table, had become a genuine symbol of a certain kind of confident, sociable hosting. And close behind it in 1971 came a very different kind of kitchen appliance, one built around the opposite philosophy entirely: the slow cooker, which promised something that felt almost magical to a busy household. You could load it with ingredients first thing in the morning, leave the house entirely for your day's work and errands, and return home in the evening to something that had spent hours quietly, patiently cooking itself without any supervision at all. This was considered, at the time, genuinely remarkable. But underneath these small pleasures, a much larger and considerably more troubling industrial system was steadily maturing, one that had been quietly building since the years just after the war ended. The 1970s represented something close to the full arrival of a food production model built around heavy processing, chemical stabilization, and engineering specifically for shelf life and flavor uniformity, rather than any particular concern for nutrition or genuine taste. The frozen dinner, having already established itself firmly in the previous 2 decades, had by now given rise to an entire, sprawling category of convenience products that, in many cases, bore only a distant, largely theoretical resemblance to the original ingredients they were supposedly built from. Cheese products appeared on shelves that required no refrigeration whatsoever. Bread was engineered to remain soft and edible for 2 full weeks without any visible staleness. An orange-flavored powdered drink, originally developed for use by astronauts and genuinely sent into space, was now sitting on ordinary grocery store shelves, marketed to families as something close to a scientific achievement they could bring home for their children. The global oil crisis of 1973 had ripple effects that reached well beyond gas station lines, pushing food prices upward across the board and making cheap, filling, heavily processed food considerably more attractive to household budgets already under real strain, while fresh produce, often more expensive and more perishable, became correspondingly less accessible to many families. Inflation ran hot and persistent throughout the entire decade, hitting grocery bills particularly hard, and the response from ordinary households was practical and entirely understandable given the circumstances. You bought whatever was genuinely affordable, and what was affordable, more often than not, sat in the shelf-stable, heavily processed middle aisles of the store rather than in the more expensive produce section near the entrance. Then, in 1977, a Senate committee focused specifically on nutrition and human needs published a set of dietary guidelines that drew a direct, explicit link between dietary fat, cholesterol, and heart disease, and American food culture shifted noticeably on its axis almost overnight. The guidelines themselves, viewed with the benefit of considerable hindsight, were admittedly imperfect, oversimplifying what was, in reality, a genuinely complicated and nuanced nutritional picture. And the food industry would go on to spend the following 2 decades skillfully, and often cynically, exploiting the resulting public anxiety for straightforward commercial profit. But regardless of the guidelines' scientific limitations, they planted a specific, deeply lasting fear around dietary fat that would go on to shape American eating behavior for decades to come. Fat, almost overnight in cultural terms, became something dangerous, something to be reduced wherever possible, removed entirely where feasible, and replaced with some alternative ingredient wherever the food industry could manage it. The grocery store, as it always does, responded to this stated consumer anxiety almost immediately by rolling out an entirely new wave of products. Low-fat options began appearing across nearly every category. Reduced fat labeling multiplied rapidly across shelves that had never previously needed to make such claims. Margarine, which had been marketed as a heart-healthier alternative to butter since its very introduction decades earlier, received a significant additional boost in sales and cultural credibility during this period. The fact that this particular margarine, in its most common commercial form at the time, actually contained trans fats considerably more harmful to cardiovascular health than the butter it was meant to replace, would not become widely understood or publicly acknowledged for roughly another 2 decades. It would, notably, not be the last time the American food industry managed to solve one nutritional concern by quietly creating an entirely new and different one in its place. The decade also gave rise to the salad bar, an innovation introduced by a restaurant chain based in San Diego in 1971, and one that spread rapidly through casual restaurant chains throughout the decade before eventually making its way into supermarkets themselves. In many ways, the salad bar represented the decade's most sincere and well-intentioned attempt at offering something genuinely fresh and minimally processed. And it was, almost immediately upon arrival, cheerfully undermined by the addition of crunchy croutons, shredded imitation bacon bits, and a generous ladle of creamy ranch dressing that rendered the underlying vegetable content largely beside the point. The decade tried, genuinely tried, to move towards something lighter and fresher, even while simultaneously stocking up on boxed dinner kits and proudly displaying a fondue pot on the good tablecloth. And the resulting contradiction was, in retrospect, entirely predictable. Now let's turn our attention to a very specific aisle, one that deserves its own extended chapter in this story: the cereal aisle, and the strange, winding journey it took from earnest medical treatment to full-blown childhood spectacle. Walk down the cereal aisle of any American supermarket during the 1970s, and you were not, in any meaningful sense, simply shopping. You were entering into a quiet, ongoing negotiation with your own children, a colorful gauntlet lined with cartoon mascots and eye-popping sugar content, and the distinct, uncomfortable possibility that the small plastic toy hidden inside the box was, in fact, the actual and primary reason your child wanted that particular breakfast in the first place. Breakfast cereal had started its life, roughly a century earlier, as something close to a health food, treated by its earliest proponents as almost medicinal in nature, even in some early formulations, deliberately punitive in flavor. By the late 1970s, it had transformed into something almost entirely unrecognizable from those origins, a delivery mechanism for marshmallow shapes styled like moons and stars, and remarkably, almost nobody paused to reflect on just how strange that particular journey had actually been. The origin story of American breakfast cereal is genuinely one of the more unusual chapters in the country's broader food history, because it begins not in a corporate test kitchen or a boardroom, but inside a sanitarium. A physician and health reformer running a well-known health institution in Michigan during the 1880s treated his patients with a regimen built around vigorous exercise, plenty of fresh air, and a diet so deliberately, aggressively bland that it functioned almost as a punishment for having a digestive system at all. This particular doctor held the strong personal conviction that meat, spices, and richly flavored food stimulated dangerous impulses in the human body, moral impulses as well as purely physical ones, and that a simple diet built around plain grains would calm both body and character alike. His original corn flakes were never designed with enjoyment in mind. They were designed, quite explicitly, to be corrective, almost medicinal in their blandness. His brother, who possessed considerably sharper commercial instincts and far fewer theories about the supposed moral consequences of a flavorful breakfast, eventually broke away from the family sanitarium business entirely, added a meaningful amount of sugar to the original corn flakes recipe, and went on to build a company that would eventually grow into one of the most recognizable cereal brands in the entire country. Around the same time, a former patient of the very same sanitarium, having fully absorbed its underlying health philosophy while also recognizing its considerable commercial potential, launched his own competing grain-based breakfast product in 1898, followed shortly afterward by a second one. By the early years of the 20th century, the small Michigan town where the original sanitarium had operated had transformed into something like the unofficial cereal capital of the entire world, home to dozens of competing companies, all of them producing grain-based breakfast products and marketing them using the same earnest, health-forward language that had defined the category from its very beginning. Cereal, in this earliest era, was marketed as good for you. It was marketed as distinctly modern. It was marketed as the sensible, forward-thinking choice for a sensible, forward-thinking household. Then came the sugar, and once it arrived, there was no going back. The gradual transition from health food to something closer to confection unfolded steadily across the 1930s and 1940s, accelerated dramatically in the years following the war, and reached something close to full, unrestrained delirium by the 1960s and 1970s. One popular cereal launched in 1953 reportedly contained a sugar content of well over half its total weight, and was still, remarkably, marketed and sold as a legitimate breakfast food. A fruit-flavored ring cereal arrived on shelves in 1963. A marshmallow-studded oat cereal, notable at the time for its genuinely novel addition of small marshmallow pieces mixed directly into the grain, launched the following year in 1964. Those marshmallow pieces were reportedly referred to internally by the manufacturer using a specific coined term, a word that exists, as far as anyone can tell, almost exclusively within the context of children's breakfast cereal, and one that few adults have ever managed to say aloud without feeling at least a small flicker of embarrassment. The cartoon mascots that accompanied these products turned out to be the real stroke of long-term commercial genius, the element that locked in brand loyalty across entire generations of American children. A cartoon tiger sold Frosted Flakes with tremendous enthusiasm. A cartoon toucan sold fruit-flavored rings. A cartoon rabbit, perpetually and comically denied access to his own namesake cereal by a rotating cast of children in the advertisements, developed what appeared to be an almost territorial instinct about a breakfast product he was never, under any circumstances, allowed to actually eat. Another mascot, a cartoon ship captain, arrived in 1963 attached to a cereal with a texture so aggressively crunchy that it reliably scraped the roof of the mouth of nearly everyone who ate it. And yet it continued selling extraordinarily well regardless, decade after decade. These characters were never simply marketing devices in the narrow sense. They functioned, for many children, as genuine companions, familiar and dependable, showing up at the kitchen table every single morning with the consistent, unwavering cheerfulness of a friend who had never once, as far as the child could tell, had a single bad day, and who also, conveniently, happened to have a small prize tucked inside his cardboard hat. The physical toy hidden inside the cereal box was, viewed from any real distance, an extraordinary commercial escalation when you stopped to really think about it. An earlier confectionery brand had been including small prizes inside its packages since as early as 1912, but the cereal industry embraced this particular practice with genuine, sustained enthusiasm throughout the 1950s and 1960s, inserting small toys, simple games, vinyl records, and collectible trinkets directly into cereal boxes as a deliberate financial incentive designed to make children specifically demand one particular product over its competitors by name. The included toy was, quite often, genuinely more interesting and more durable than the cereal itself. In some documented cases, the toy was, quite plainly, the entire and only reason a particular box was purchased at all. Parents understood exactly what was happening, understood the transparent manipulation at work, and bought the cereal anyway, because the realistic alternative was an extended negotiation with a tired, insistent child at 7 o'clock in the morning that few parents had the patience or energy to fully engage with before their first cup of coffee. By the 1980s, the cereal aisle had evolved into arguably the single most psychologically sophisticated section of the entire grocery store. Products were deliberately placed at child eye level, well below where an adult shopper would naturally be looking, and packaged in bright, dynamic colors featuring energetic cartoon characters, specifically designed to make calm, rational purchasing decisions nearly impossible for any shopper under the age of roughly 12. The original earnest health claims that had launched the entire category a full century earlier were, technically, still present somewhere on the box, printed in small, easily overlooked type near the bottom of the nutritional panel, entirely accurate and almost entirely ignored by everyone standing in front of the shelf. Above that small print, in dramatically larger and bolder lettering, a brightly colored cartoon bird or tiger or rabbit was cheerfully promising that breakfast itself could be a genuine adventure. And somehow, against any reasonable expectation, that particular promise is the one that ultimately won out. Now let's move into the freezer section, because it grew, across these same decades, into something genuinely enormous, and the story of how that happened is worth telling properly. In the earliest days of the American supermarket, the frozen food section occupied a relatively small, modest footprint, generally limited to basic frozen vegetables and various flavors of ice cream. Then, somewhere across the 1960s and 1970s, American food scientists arrived at a realization that could reasonably be described as either genuinely visionary or, depending on your perspective, mildly concerning. It turned out that almost anything, given the right process, could be frozen, later thawed, and technically still eaten by a human being without immediate harm. By the 1980s, the frozen aisle had expanded dramatically to include complete multi-course dinners, breakfast burritos, stuffed peppers, fish sticks, small pizza-flavored snack rolls, and a genuinely dizzying array of other products, all of which quietly raised the same faintly philosophical question every time you stood in front of the glass freezer doors. Is this actually food, in any traditional sense, or is this more accurately described as the general idea of food, rendered shelf-stable through the miracle of industrial freezing? The individual most directly responsible for making high-quality frozen food commercially viable in the first place was a man who had spent time observing indigenous communities in Labrador during the 1910s, watching closely as they froze fresh fish using techniques passed down through generations. And he came away with a genuinely important realization. The real key to producing quality frozen food lay entirely in the speed of the freezing process itself. Freeze food quickly enough, he understood, and the resulting ice crystals that form within it remain small enough that they don't rupture the food's individual cell walls, meaning the food largely retains its original texture and flavor once it's later thawed and prepared. He went on to develop a genuinely effective commercial flash freezing process, eventually selling the underlying patents to a major food conglomerate in 1929 for a sum reported at $22 million, an extraordinary amount of money for that era, and then spent much of the remainder of his life restlessly inventing other things entirely unrelated to frozen food, including an early infrared heat lamp and a method for converting leftover sugar cane waste into usable paper. He was, by most accounts, simply the kind of person constitutionally incapable of leaving a technical problem unsolved, a trait for which, whatever you think of the modern frozen burrito, the world arguably owes him some genuine gratitude. The earliest frozen food sections were fairly limited, constrained both by the available freezing and storage technology of the era, and by what ordinary consumers were actually willing to accept as reasonable substitutes for fresh food. Frozen vegetables were the very first genuine commercial success story. Peas, corn kernels, and green beans that could be stored essentially indefinitely and prepared fully in a matter of minutes, representing a real, tangible improvement over the canned versions of the same vegetables, which had often been boiled well past the point of recognizable texture. Frozen orange juice concentrate, introduced commercially in 1945, was received at the time as something close to revolutionary, offering consumers fresh-tasting juice year-round from a simple can stored in the home freezer. Two major companies built substantial parts of their entire business around these two single products. But the truly ambitious expansion of the frozen aisle came later, during the 1960s and 1970s, when a specific combination of factors, the gradually increasing availability of home microwave ovens, growing numbers of women entering the paid workforce, and aggressive, sustained investment by the food industry into convenience product development, together pushed the frozen section into genuinely ambitious new territory. Frozen pizza arrived during this period, initially fairly mediocre in quality and gradually, incrementally improving over the following years. Frozen lasagna followed, along with frozen enchiladas and frozen pot pies whose pastry crusts ranged, depending heavily on the specific brand and your own oven's particular quirks, from genuinely delicious to structurally questionable at best. One major brand entered the frozen meal category in 1975, bringing with it a noticeably higher level of ambition than its competitors. Multiple distinct components arranged together on a single tray, actual sauces, dedicated side dishes, a general sense of culinary effort that made the earlier generation of simpler frozen dinners look almost apologetic by direct comparison. The frozen pizza roll deserves a genuine moment of its own in this story. Introduced under a specific brand name in 1968, these small individual pockets of tomato sauce and cheese encased in a thin, deep-fried or oven-baked dough shell became, over the following decades, one of the most genuinely beloved frozen products in all of American food history. They were not, by any reasonable nutritional standard, particularly good for you. They were not, in any culinary sense, especially sophisticated. They required, as a matter of practical necessity, waiting several full minutes after removal from the oven before eating, or else risking a painful burn to the roof of the mouth so severe that it would reliably be remembered for years afterward, a risk that, tellingly, approximately nobody ever seemed to fully learn from after their very first painful experience with it. And yet they were consumed in genuinely enormous quantities, by both children and fully grown adults who really ought to have known better by that point in their lives, and were eaten, by all accounts, entirely without remorse. The steady expansion of the frozen aisle across these decades reflected something genuine and deeply rooted about the broader American appetite for convenience above nearly all else. But it also reflected something equally genuine about a distinctly American faith in technological solutions generally. If the freezing process could successfully preserve something as simple as corn kernels or a glass of orange juice, then surely, the underlying logic seemed to suggest, there was no meaningful culinary application anywhere that couldn't ultimately be improved through transformation into a shelf-stable product waiting patiently in your home freezer until the exact moment you needed it. The actual results of this widespread ambition were, predictably, quite uneven in practice. Some frozen products turned out to be genuinely excellent. Others amounted to something closer to a broken culinary promise. But the underlying ambition itself remained remarkably consistent throughout. America believed in its frozen aisle the same way it tended to believe in most new technological solutions of this general era. Thoroughly, enthusiastically, and in more than a few documented cases, somewhat ahead of the actual supporting evidence. By the 1990s, the frozen food section of a typical American supermarket occupied more total floor space than nearly any other single department in the entire store. A genuine cathedral of humming glass-doored refrigeration units containing seemingly endless variety. A determined shopper could, in principle, eat every single meal for several consecutive weeks sourced entirely from the frozen aisle without ever meaningfully repeating themselves, a fact that could reasonably be interpreted as either quietly liberating or, depending on your particular relationship with the broader concept of food, faintly dystopian. Either way, the frozen aisle had, by any reasonable measure, decisively won its long argument for a permanent and expanding place in the American kitchen. And somewhere, one imagines, the man who had simply set out, decades earlier, to properly freeze a piece of fish, was presumably at some genuine peace with exactly where his original idea had eventually led. Somewhere around 1982, it feels almost as though the entire country looked down at its own dinner plate, took a long, uneasy breath, and decided that everything needed to be rearranged, immediately and completely. Oat bran, a fairly obscure ingredient that most Americans had never given a single moment's thought to before, suddenly became something close to a household obsession. The phrase fat-free stopped being a simple description and transformed into a genuine moral category, something that separated good food from bad food in a way that felt less like nutrition and more like ethics. Aerobics classes were filling strip mall studios in every mid-sized town in the country. And the grocery store, always responsive to whatever anxiety happened to be dominating the national conversation at any given moment, responded by carving out entirely new sections filled with products that were, in a strictly technical sense, still edible, but had, in the process of being made healthier, quietly stripped away whatever had originally made them enjoyable to eat in the first place. Fat-free cookies that somehow managed to be simultaneously dense and hollow. Salad dressing advertised as containing no fat whatsoever, which tasted, by more than a few honest accounts from the era, something close to cold regret poured over lettuce. Reduced sodium versions of products up and down every aisle. The American grocery store had discovered, in this decade, a genuinely remarkable truth about its own customers. They would happily pay a premium for food that had been deliberately made a little bit worse. This particular panic had actually been quietly building since the late 1970s, when the Senate Dietary Guidelines discussed earlier had first identified dietary fat and cholesterol as the primary villains in the American diet. But it did not reach its full, saturating cultural peak until the early 1980s, and the specific trigger that pushed it over the edge is worth examining closely, because it is a little more ironic than it first appears. The sudden, explosive national fitness boom. A home workout video released in 1982 by a well-known actress and fitness personality reportedly sold something in the range of 17 million copies, an almost unimaginable number for a home exercise tape, and it managed, more or less single-handedly, to convince an entire generation of ordinary Americans that they were finally, seriously, going to get their bodies into shape. Aerobics classes proliferated rapidly across the country. Running transformed from a fairly niche activity into a genuine lifestyle marker. Gym membership, which had previously been a fairly specialized pursuit limited mostly to serious bodybuilders and competitive athletes, suddenly became something ordinary suburban adults simply did, or at the very least, something they paid a monthly fee for and occasionally attended. Alongside this newfound and often quite public physical self-consciousness came a correspondingly heightened awareness of exactly what was going into the mouth, and what was going into the mouth suddenly seemed, for the first time in a long while, genuinely worth actively worrying about on a daily basis. The food industry's response to this shift was swift, remarkably profitable, and if we are being entirely honest about it, not always especially truthful. The clear mandate coming from consumers themselves was simple enough on its face. Less fat, please. The food industry's actual interpretation of that mandate, however, proved to be considerably more creative than most consumers realized at the time. Remove the fat from a given product. Replace it with additional sugar, various starches, or chemical emulsifiers specifically engineered to replicate fat's original textural qualities, and then confidently label the entire resulting product as healthy. A particular line of fat-free chocolate sandwich cookies, launched by a major snack food company in 1992, became, in many ways, the single defining product of this entire era. These cookies were marketed so aggressively and so persuasively as a legitimate health food that consumers reportedly ate them in quantities large enough to fully negate, and in many documented cases considerably exceed, whatever modest caloric benefit the fat-free formulation was supposed to provide in the first place. This exact phenomenon eventually earned its own specific name within behavioral nutrition research, describing the broader pattern of people eating noticeably more of a given product simply because it carried a low-fat label, ultimately consuming more total calories in the process than they likely would have from the original, full-fat version of the same product. The cookies themselves, it should be said in fairness, were not innocent bystanders in any of this. They were, by most accounts, genuinely quite good at being cookies, and people, understandably, ate the entire box in one sitting. Oat Bran experienced its own specific and fairly intense cultural moment in 1988, following the publication of a widely reported study suggesting the ingredient could meaningfully help reduce cholesterol levels, which, in the context of the era's broader fat panic, was now understood as directly connected to serious heart disease risk. Within just a few months of that study's publication, Oat Bran had been added to seemingly everything on the shelf: muffins, breakfast cereals, sliced bread, crackers, and countless other products that had no natural or historical relationship to oats whatsoever, essentially using the ingredient purely as a marketable label claim rather than a meaningful nutritional addition. Restaurants across the country began adding Oat Bran muffins to their breakfast menus. Supermarkets built entire dedicated display sections just for Oat Bran products. A follow-up study published roughly a year later suggested the original cholesterol-reducing effect had been meaningfully overstated, and the surrounding frenzy subsided almost as quickly as it had appeared. But for a stretch of roughly 18 months, Oat Bran was treated across American grocery stores with something close to genuine religious reverence. A related but distinct anxiety around sodium developed alongside this fat panic throughout the decade, driven by a separate but parallel body of research connecting high dietary sodium intake to hypertension and its associated cardiovascular risks. The reduced sodium label began appearing across essentially every category in the store, including on products where the original sodium content had actually been entirely unremarkable to begin with, and where the newly reformulated reduced sodium version noticeably tasted worse than the original, a trade-off many consumers accepted willingly because the label itself provided a genuine sense of comfort and reassurance. Consumers bought these products anyway, in large volumes. The price premium attached to them was real and measurable. Lower sodium products frequently cost meaningfully more than their entirely ordinary equivalents sitting on the very same shelf, a pricing strategy that required the manufacturer to have considerable confidence in just how deep the underlying consumer anxiety actually ran, and that confidence turned out to be entirely justified, because the products sold well and complaints were relatively rare. What this entire 1980s health food panic ultimately produced, when you step back and look at the full decade in retrospect, was not, by any reasonable measure, a genuinely healthier American diet overall. National obesity rates continued climbing steadily throughout the decade, and then accelerated further through the 1990s that followed. What the panic actually produced, more than anything else, was an entirely new and remarkably durable layer of nutritional anxiety woven permanently into the ordinary act of grocery shopping, an experience now thoroughly haunted by competing labels and competing health claims, and by the persistent, nagging sense that the single correct choice on any given shelf was always just one more piece of information away, always just out of reach. The grocery store itself had grown noticeably more complicated. The average shopper walking through it had grown noticeably more confused, and the food industry, which had been directly responsible for creating both that complexity and that confusion in the first place, was, by nearly every financial measure available, doing extremely well for itself throughout the entire period. Now let's turn to a rather different figure who emerged in American grocery stores throughout this same decade. A shopper defined not primarily by health anxiety, but by something closer to aspiration and taste. The newly arrived urban professional, freshly equipped with real disposable income for the first time, and somewhat suddenly, some genuinely strong opinions about the correct kind of mustard to keep in the refrigerator. Where an earlier generation had reached for a familiar yellow mustard without a second thought, this new shopper stood in front of an imported Dijon mustard and felt something close to a genuine, quiet swell of personal self-determination in the choice itself. Specialty food sections throughout the grocery store began expanding steadily to accommodate this shift. Balsamic vinegar started appearing on shelves where it had never been stocked before. Someone somewhere began successfully selling sun-dried tomatoes at a price point that strongly implied each individual tomato had been carefully dried by hand by dedicated Tuscan artisans, which, in at least some documented cases, was entirely and genuinely true. Food, across this decade, had quietly become a direct expression of personal taste, and personal taste, in turn, had quietly become a fairly reliable marker of social class. The specific term used to describe this new kind of shopper, a slightly awkward acronym built from the phrase young urban professional, entered common American vocabulary around 1982 and was used both aspirationally, by people who genuinely wanted to be seen that way, and as a fairly mild insult, depending entirely on who happened to be using the word in any given conversation. This particular shopper was defined partly by their actual income level and partly by their broader patterns of consumption more generally. They tended to drive a certain recognizable kind of car. They favored a certain recognizable style of running shoe. And they ate, quite noticeably, a certain recognizable kind of food. The food component of this broader identity was especially visible, in a way that many of the other markers simply weren't. Because what a person served at a small dinner party, or what they kept stocked in their own kitchen pantry, communicated something fairly specific about who they were, where they had traveled or lived, and what kind of person they considered themselves to fundamentally be. For this particular shopper, the answer they were reaching for through their grocery choices was almost always some version of sophisticated, worldly, and pointedly uninterested in anything resembling a plain yellow mustard bottle. Whole-grain breads and genuinely artisan-style loaves began appearing on the shelves of stores that had, until quite recently, offered little beyond standard white sandwich bread and perhaps one modest rye option. Sun-dried tomatoes, a technique Italian home cooks had actually been using for many generations as a practical way to preserve surplus summer tomatoes, arrived in American specialty grocery stores in the early 1980s, typically packed carefully in olive oil and priced in a way that strongly implied real scarcity. In reality, they were not scarce at all. They represented a simple, traditional drying technique available to essentially anyone with access to tomatoes and reliable summer sunlight. But within the specific context of the American specialty grocery aisle, they read as exotic and worldly, and exotic in this particular cultural moment was something a great many shoppers were genuinely willing to pay a real premium for. Traditional balsamic vinegar, produced in the Modena region of Italy and carefully aged for years inside wooden barrels, developing a rich, complex sweetness entirely unlike ordinary wine vinegar, made its way into the American home pantry during this era, and notably, never really left again. It was quickly followed onto specialty shelves by genuine extra virgin olive oil, jarred pesto sauce, capers, and anchovies, products that had in truth been perfectly standard staples in Italian home kitchens for generations, and were now being enthusiastically discovered by American shoppers who approached them with the same reverent, slightly breathless enthusiasm of genuine explorers uncovering something entirely new. One particular home goods retailer, which had actually been quietly selling French cookware since the 1950s, became something close to a cultural touchstone, specifically for this yuppie food moment during the 1980s. It was a store where a shopper could purchase a proper copper sauté pan, a dedicated pasta-making machine, and a small bottle of genuine truffle oil, all in a single visit, and all of it together strongly implied that the buyer was exactly the kind of person who cooked with real intention and real seriousness. The actual cooking itself, it should be noted honestly, was not always genuinely the point of the purchase. The equipment functioned, quite openly, as a kind of signal, and the well-stocked pantry became something close to a personal portrait on display. Having precisely the right ingredients sitting visibly in your kitchen communicated something meaningful about the kind of life you were actively living, or at least the kind of life you sincerely aspired to live. The food itself was, in a very real sense, doing identity work that food had never previously been asked to perform quite so explicitly. The supermarket industry responded to this emerging trend by creating dedicated specialty sections, usually positioned somewhere near the existing deli counter or cheese case, where imported and artisan-style products could be clustered together, separated from the rest of the ordinary store both by a noticeably higher price point and by a distinct, quietly cultivated atmosphere of mild exclusivity. These specialty sections grew steadily throughout the 1980s as the broader specialty food market itself expanded, and the individual products within them gradually became more mainstream over time. Dijon mustard, which had genuinely required a trip to a specialty store back in 1980, had become an entirely standard pantry staple sitting on the ordinary shelf by roughly 1995. Balsamic vinegar, which had similarly required a dedicated specialty shop in the early 1980s, was sitting comfortably on the regular vinegar shelf right alongside plain white vinegar by the middle of the following decade. The specialty section's entire ongoing function in this sense was always to sit slightly ahead of the mainstream curve, quietly introducing whatever the next thing was that would eventually, given enough time, become simply normal. What this entire yuppie pantry moment firmly established, and what has genuinely never been fully dismantled in the decades since, is the broader underlying idea that individual food choices function as character choices, that what a person buys at the grocery store communicates something genuinely meaningful about who they are, what they personally value, and how seriously they take the whole broader business of eating. This particular idea has continued to proliferate and deepen considerably in the decades since it first took hold, producing a food culture of real complexity and, occasionally, real absurdity. But it began, improbably enough, with a single jar of imported mustard sitting on a specialty shelf sometime in 1983, and someone deciding, quite deliberately, to reach for that jar instead of the familiar yellow one, and feeling, briefly but entirely genuinely, like a slightly more interesting version of themselves in that moment. Now let's talk about a very different kind of shopping experience that emerged during this same general period, one built not around careful curation and specialty ingredients, but around raw, overwhelming scale. When the first warehouse club stores opened their doors and began expanding rapidly throughout the 1980s, something shifted in the American psyche that there has genuinely been no fully recovering from since. The warehouse store offered a remarkably simple and remarkably effective proposition to shoppers. Why would you ever buy just one of something when you could instead buy 48 of it, at a noticeably lower price per individual unit? Almost overnight, it seemed, Americans were purchasing mayonnaise packaged in containers roughly the size of a small child, toilet paper in quantities that quietly implied some fairly deep underlying anxiety about the uncertain future, and individual muffins roughly the size of a human head, all sold at prices that made simply declining to buy them feel almost irresponsible. Abundance had always been part of the broader American promise, going back generations. The warehouse store simply turned that promise into a straightforward square footage problem. The specific warehouse club retail model traces back to a very particular origin point. A San Diego-based retailer opened the very first store of this kind in 1976, housed inside a converted airplane hangar, and built specifically to serve small business owners who wanted the ability to buy essential goods in bulk at genuine wholesale pricing. The membership fee itself turned out to be the single most important innovation embedded in the entire model. By charging customers directly just for the basic privilege of shopping there, the store effectively created a self-selecting, highly motivated customer base who now had a clear financial incentive to shop there frequently enough to justify the fee they had already paid up front. The stores themselves were deliberately Spartan in their design and presentation. Bare concrete floors, simple metal warehouse shelving, products displayed directly inside their original shipping boxes rather than in any curated retail display. No decorative investment of any kind anywhere in the building. The complete absence of any conventional retail atmosphere was, in itself, part of the core message being communicated to shoppers. We are deliberately not spending any money on making this particular shopping trip feel pleasant, and in exchange, we are passing those specific savings directly along to you in the concrete form of a 48-pack of granola bars sold at an unbeatable per-unit price. Two competing major warehouse chains launched within the same general period, one founded in Seattle in 1983 by an executive who had previously worked directly with the original San Diego founder, and a second, entirely separate chain launched that very same year by a retail entrepreneur who had already built one of the largest discount store chains in the country. The overall format proved to be almost impossibly attractive to a broad swath of American consumers, and the underlying reasons for that appeal run considerably deeper than simple price savings alone. The warehouse store tapped directly into something close to a primal cultural impulse regarding Americans and abundance, an impulse that had been quietly running underneath the entire retail landscape since the very first supermarkets first opened their doors decades earlier, promising customers everything, all in one convenient place. The warehouse store simply asked a further, more ambitious question in response. And what if we actually meant that promise, completely and without any real limit? The sheer physical scale of everything inside these stores became, in itself, a central part of the overall shopping experience. Products at a typical warehouse club were never simply large in some ordinary sense. They were large in a way that genuinely redefined a shopper's basic sense of what a normal quantity even looked like. A jar of peanut butter roughly the size of a paint can, a package of raw chicken breasts requiring both hands just to carry comfortably, an entire flat of canned tomatoes substantial enough to supply a small restaurant for a full week, or an ordinary household for what genuinely felt like an entire geological era. Simply standing in front of these oversized products produced a very particular kind of physical and emotional sensation in most shoppers, a mixture of real satisfaction, a small flicker of alarm, and a quiet, persistent conviction that you were somehow getting away with something that an ordinary neighborhood grocery store could simply never replicate. The rotisserie chicken eventually became one particular warehouse chain's single most iconic and widely discussed product. A whole roasted chicken, sold near the store's exit, priced remarkably low and held steady at that same low price for well over a decade, reportedly sold at an actual financial loss because the company had correctly identified it as an extremely effective traffic driver. Something that reliably pulled shoppers all the way to the back of the store and generated a level of genuine customer goodwill entirely disproportionate to the chicken's own thin profit margin. This particular rotisserie chicken is, in a very real sense, not simply a chicken at all. It functions as a genuine cultural artifact, a reliable loyalty mechanism, and a clear proof of concept demonstrating that the warehouse retail format had grasped something important about American consumer desire that ordinary supermarkets were considerably slower to fully understand and act on. The underlying psychological dynamics at play inside the warehouse store are genuinely worth examining closely, because they are remarkably specific and remarkably effective. The membership fee itself creates a powerful sunk cost motivation in the shopper's mind. You have already paid money specifically for the ongoing privilege of shopping here. And so, the underlying logic suggests you really ought to buy enough to fully justify having paid that fee in the first place. The sheer physical scale of the products themselves creates a strong anchoring effect on price perception. A 48-pack of bottled water seems entirely reasonably priced when compared side by side against a 24-pack sold elsewhere at double the per-unit cost, even when you genuinely have nowhere convenient in your home to store 48 bottles of water for any meaningful length of time. And a genuine treasure hunt element, particularly pronounced at one of the two major chains, with its constantly rotating selection of non-grocery merchandise, electronics, clothing, furniture, books, and occasionally, memorably, a kayak, creates an entire browsing experience built around the real stakes of discovery, where a shopper might stumble across something genuinely extraordinary, or might find nothing of particular interest at all, but will almost certainly walk out having found at least one single thing they hadn't previously realized they needed. The warehouse store never really replaced the ordinary neighborhood supermarket in most American households. Instead, it carved out its own distinct place within the broader rhythm of the shopping week, functioning as the big periodic trip, the deliberate restocking mission, more of an expedition than a routine errand. But it permanently shifted the underlying baseline expectation of what genuine value at the grocery store was even supposed to look like, and it made a certain scale of everyday abundance feel not merely available on occasion, but genuinely normal, unremarkable, simply part of ordinary life. The 48-pack was no longer, in any real sense, extravagant. It was simply Tuesday. The microwave oven had technically been available for home purchase since the 1950s, but it took until the very beginning of the 1980s for it to genuinely colonize the American kitchen in any meaningful, widespread way. And once it did, it brought along with it an entirely new category of grocery product, one built specifically around its particular capabilities. The frozen and tray designed from the ground up for microwave preparation rather than conventional oven baking. One major brand launched in 1981, followed shortly afterward by a competitor built around similar principles. The underlying pitch to consumers was genuinely elegant in its simplicity. A complete meal, carefully portion-controlled, nutritionally balanced according to the standards of the era, requiring nothing more from the shopper than roughly 4 minutes of waiting and the basic ability to peel back a small corner of plastic film before placing the tray inside the microwave. This was not, in the framing of its marketing, being presented as any kind of compromise. This was being presented as evolution itself, as the genuine future of the American evening meal, and that particular future, it turned out, smelled faintly of steamed broccoli and a certain quiet, low-grade disappointment. The microwave's own origin story is, like a surprising number of major 20th century food technologies, another happy accident of American industrial engineering. An engineer working for a major defense contractor was conducting research with radar equipment back in 1945 when he noticed, quite by chance, that a chocolate bar sitting in his pocket had melted completely while he happened to be standing near an active magnetron, the specific device responsible for generating the microwave radiation used inside radar systems of that era. His reaction to this discovery was reportedly one of genuine curiosity rather than any real alarm, which says something fairly telling about the particular temperament apparently required to work successfully in industrial radar engineering during the 1940s. He went on to experiment further, first with a bag of popcorn, which reportedly popped successfully, and then with a raw egg, which reportedly exploded rather dramatically, and shortly afterward filed a formal patent application for an entirely new kind of cooking device built around focused microwave radiation. the very first commercially available microwave oven, introduced in 1947, stood roughly 6 feet tall, weighed a genuinely staggering 750 pounds, and carried a price tag of around $5,000, a genuinely enormous sum at the time. It was installed almost exclusively in restaurants and large institutional kitchens. It was decidedly not making its way into anyone's ordinary home kitchen. The far more compact countertop microwave finally arrived commercially in the early 1970s, still relatively expensive at first, but gradually becoming more affordable with each passing year. And by the early 1980s, it had achieved exactly the kind of widespread household market penetration that finally caught the serious attention of major food companies. Once a meaningful majority of American kitchens contained a working microwave oven, products specifically designed and formulated for microwave cooking were no longer some small, experimental niche category. They had become, almost overnight, a genuine and substantial mainstream category in their own right. One major frozen food company, which had actually been producing traditional frozen dinners since as far back as the 1960s, repositioned much of its product line specifically to serve this new microwave era. The 1981 launch mentioned earlier, positioned as a sub-brand specifically built around the dual promise of genuine convenience and careful calorie control, with most of its individual meals falling somewhere under 300 total calories, found an eager, receptive audience almost immediately, particularly among working women who needed a quick, controlled lunch option at their office desk. And among a broader population of dieters who wanted meaningful portion control without having to do any actual food preparation themselves, this particular emphasis on strict portion control was entirely deliberate and entirely central to the product's overall appeal. The individual tray itself was noticeably small. The contents inside were carefully measured out in advance. The consumer never had to actively decide how much to eat in any given sitting, because the packaging itself had already made that decision on their behalf. And this removed a specific kind of ongoing cognitive burden that a great many people, according to consumer research from the era, found genuinely difficult to manage entirely on their own. The fact that the resulting portion also happened to be fairly small, a detail that some early consumers reportedly addressed simply by purchasing and eating 2 full trays at once, was treated as distinctly secondary to the broader sense of relief that came from having the underlying decision already made for you before you ever opened the box. Food companies had, by this point, correctly identified that what a great many consumers genuinely wanted was not merely convenience in some general sense, but something closer to structure itself. A complete meal that clearly told you exactly what it was, precisely how much of it there was, exactly how long it would take to prepare, and then reliably delivered on every one of those specific terms without asking anything further of you in return. The microwave fundamentally changed the underlying relationship between cooking and time in ways that earlier convenience products, for all their genuine popularity, had never quite managed to achieve on their own. The original frozen dinner tray, remember, had still required a full 25 minutes inside a conventional oven. The new microwave meal required only 4. 4 minutes sits so close to genuinely immediate that the small intervening wait barely even registers as waiting at all in any meaningful psychological sense. You pressed a few buttons, turned your attention briefly elsewhere, heard a short beeping sound, and your food was simply ready. The entire process had become so thoroughly compressed that it stopped feeling like cooking in any traditional sense whatsoever, and instead began to feel like something closer to simple retrieval. You were, in a very real sense, retrieving your evening meal from an appliance in much the same way you might retrieve a tray of ice cubes from your freezer, a straightforward transaction rather than any genuine act of preparation. It is worth pausing here to genuinely acknowledge what was quietly lost in the course of this particular transaction. The physical act of actually preparing food, measuring ingredients carefully, cutting vegetables, combining components together, monitoring a pot on the stove. Adjusting seasoning as you go also functions, for a great many people, as a genuine form of mental decompression, a physical activity that occupies the hands directly while simultaneously redirecting and calming the mind. Cooking from scratch is very often, according to people who have deliberately stopped doing it regularly, and then later return to it, the specific thing they find themselves genuinely missing most once it's gone from their routine, not necessarily the finished result itself, but the actual process of making it happen with their own two hands. The microwave meal removed that entire process completely and replaced it with little more than a beeping sound. And a beeping sound, whatever modest virtues it may possess, is simply not, in any meaningful sense, a therapeutic experience. What emerged from the microwave at the end of those 4 minutes was hot, was genuinely edible, and sat exactly 4 minutes removed from whatever hunger had preceded it. What it distinctly was not, in any real sense, was an experience. And the slow, steady erosion of the evening meal as a genuine experience, as something that took real time and produced real pleasure through means beyond simply the act of eating itself, stands as one of the longer-running and more quietly significant consequences of the broader microwave revolution. The 4-minute dinner was, without question, genuinely fast. Whether it was actually better remained a question the packaging itself never really addressed. Now let's turn to a very different kind of grocery store entirely, one built not around speed or portion control, but around an almost opposite set of values: transparency, ingredient quality, and a fairly new idea that the food itself could somehow be clean. When the very first location of what would eventually become one of the most influential grocery chains in the country opened its doors in Austin, Texas, back in 1980, it was genuinely not obvious at the time that this particular store would eventually go on to help redefine American grocery culture as a whole, reshape the broader public meaning of the word organic, and establish the going market rate for a single bottle of cold-pressed juice. But that is, more or less, exactly what happened over the following decades. This store, and the broader natural food movement it played a central role in popularizing, introduced an entirely new set of underlying values into the American grocery store experience. Genuine provenance, real ingredient transparency, and the increasingly widespread idea that food itself could be described as clean, a word that had previously been reserved almost exclusively for describing dishes or freshly mopped floors, but now applied with growing frequency to your shopping cart, your physical body, and by quiet extension, something close to your soul. The broader natural food movement that had come before this particular store's founding had actually been quietly building since the late 1960s, driven by the very same countercultural energy of that era that had already begun raising serious questions about industrial agriculture, chemical food additives, and the general overall direction American food production seemed to be heading. The very first natural food cooperatives, member-owned stores stocking whole grains, organic produce, and products deliberately made without any artificial additives, began appearing in college towns and certain urban neighborhoods throughout the early 1970s, serving a growing community of consumers who had read influential books about sustainable eating, understood in some real technical detail what specific food additives like carrageenan actually were, and would genuinely rather grind their own peanut butter by hand than purchase a jar of the conventional commercial version. These early stores were, by most accounts, earnest, somewhat austere in their presentation, and frequently housed inside spaces that had clearly not been originally designed with any real retail purpose in mind. The underlying ideology behind them was genuinely sound. The actual shopping experience itself, however, was not especially aspirational or inviting to a broader mainstream audience. The young entrepreneur who eventually co-founded the Austin store, launching the business at just 25 years old, alongside his girlfriend at the time and two additional business partners, working out of a converted Victorian house, understood something important that the earlier generation of natural food cooperatives had largely missed. The exact same underlying product line offered by a typical natural food co-op could, in principle, be delivered inside a retail environment that didn't feel, to an ordinary shopper, quite so much like a homework assignment. That very first store was noticeably larger than any natural food store that had come before it, genuinely well lit, carefully organized, and staffed by employees who seemed authentically interested in the products they were actually selling. It looked, in nearly every meaningful respect, like a real, legitimate supermarket, which, in point of fact, it genuinely was, except that every single product inside it had been deliberately selected according to a specific and fairly rigorous set of standards around ingredients, sourcing practices, and production methods that the conventional American supermarket down the street had simply never bothered to apply. Growth for this new kind of grocery chain was fairly slow at first, but accelerated dramatically throughout the 1990s. The company expanded steadily through a combination of new store openings and strategic acquisitions of smaller regional natural food chains, entering major metropolitan markets across the country and successfully introducing the broader natural food concept to a whole new group of consumers who had never actively sought it out themselves, but discovered, once they actually encountered it firsthand, that they genuinely preferred shopping this way. The stores themselves were, without question, noticeably more expensive than a conventional supermarket. A somewhat unflattering nickname referencing the store's prices as consuming an entire paycheck arrived fairly early in its history and stuck around firmly for decades afterward. But the overall shopping experience clearly justified that price premium for a specific, well-defined kind of shopper, one who had meaningful disposable income available, held real concerns about the broader practices of industrial food production, and had a genuine appetite for the store's core underlying brand promise, that what they were buying here was simply better. Better for their own personal health, better for the surrounding environment, and better in a broader way than the conventional grocery store down the street, with its standard conventional produce section, and its lengthy ingredient labels requiring something close to a chemistry degree to fully parse. Simply was not. The organic certification label functioned as the primary engine driving this entire broader shift. Certified organic status, formally regulated at the federal level by the United States Department of Agriculture beginning in 2002, became a widely understood shorthand in the general consumer vocabulary for the broader idea of clean, generally meaning food produced free from synthetic pesticides, free from genetically modified organisms, and grown according to a set of standards that reflected at least some meaningful degree of concern for the surrounding ecological impact of the farming process itself. The actual price premium attached to organic products was real and, in many cases, quite significant. Organic produce typically costs somewhere between 30 and 50% more than its conventional equivalent, a genuinely substantial price gap that the broader market absorbed without much visible resistance, at least among the specific demographic actively shopping at natural food stores of this kind. The underlying scientific question of whether organic food was actually meaningfully superior in terms of nutritional content compared to conventionally grown food was, and remains, genuinely complicated and actively contested within the scientific community. The separate question of whether it simply felt better, on an emotional level, to purchase and bring home was not complicated in the slightest. It felt considerably better to a great many shoppers, and that particular feeling was, by any honest measure, doing the vast majority of the actual persuasive work. The rise of this new kind of natural grocery chain ended up changing the broader conventional supermarket industry simply by existing successfully in the marketplace. Established supermarket chains, which had largely ignored the natural food market entirely throughout the 1980s, began adding their own dedicated organic sections during the 1990s in direct response. By the early 2000s, even the largest and most conventional big-box retailers in the country had begun stocking organic produce on their shelves. The core underlying values that this natural food chain had originally introduced, real transparency, genuine ingredient quality, meaningful sourcing accountability, had migrated steadily from a fairly specialized retailer into the broader grocery mainstream at a pace that essentially nobody involved in the original natural food cooperative movement of the 1970s had realistically anticipated. The broader clean food idea had, in a very real sense, won this particular cultural argument, or had at least won it thoroughly enough to become genuinely available at nearly every major supermarket chain in the country, typically clustered together in a dedicated section, positioned somewhere near the existing health food aisle, where the prices tended to run noticeably higher. The packaging tended to lean heavily on green coloring, and the underlying implicit message communicated to every shopper walking past was more or less the same. This, right here, is what doing it properly looks like, provided you happen to be able to afford it. The 1990s deserve to be remembered, among a great many other things, as something close to the golden age of the American snack food. Not the modest, restrained between-meal nibble that earlier generations had grown up with, a single apple, a small handful of crackers eaten quietly and without much ceremony, the kind of small snack that seemed to understand and accept its own modest place in the day. The snack food of the 1990s was something else entirely. It was ambitious. It was engineered specifically for maximum flavor impact on first bite. It was shelf-stable for months at a time, and it arrived, more often than not, inside a bag large enough to comfortably double as a small decorative pillow. Fruit-flavored gel snacks with liquid centers, small cookie-shaped animals meant to be dipped into a separate container of frosting, individually packaged combinations of crackers, meat, and cheese marketed directly at children's lunchboxes, brightly colored brownies wrapped individually in cheerful foil, string cheese sold in quantities that would have seemed excessive even to a professional dairy farmer a generation earlier. The American food industry had, somewhere along the way, made a genuinely important discovery. If you gave a snack food product a fun, memorable name and attached a cartoon mascot to it, people would eat it in significant quantities regardless of whether they were actually hungry at the time. And this particular discovery turned out to be, from a purely commercial standpoint, essentially inexhaustible. The broader snack food category had, of course, existed for many decades before the 1990s arrived. Potato chips had been around commercially since the 1850s. Pretzels traced their American roots back to colonial times. A well-known corn chip brand had been on shelves since 1932. But the 1990s represented something genuinely different, a real qualitative shift in both the underlying ambition of individual snack products and the broader cultural permission being granted to eat them essentially constantly, throughout the entire day. 3 structured meals a day had functioned as the dominant organizing norm across most of American food history, with snacking occupying a distinctly supplementary, somewhat apologetic position within that broader structure. The 1990s dismantled that entire architecture quietly, almost completely, and did so without much public fanfare or resistance. The concept of grazing, eating smaller amounts of food frequently throughout the day rather than concentrating intake around 3 fixed meal times, was originally introduced as a fairly specific nutritional concept within certain fitness and diet circles, and was subsequently adopted, rapidly and enthusiastically, as a broader everyday lifestyle by a great many people who had no particular interest whatsoever in its original nutritional rationale, and simply found it genuinely convenient and enjoyable to eat small things whenever the mood struck them throughout the day. The American food industry responded to this cultural shift with what can only honestly be described as tremendous enthusiasm. One particular product, introduced by a major meat and cheese manufacturer in 1988 and reaching truly full cultural saturation in the early 1990s, was not, technically speaking, marketed to consumers as a snack at all. It was marketed explicitly as a complete lunch, but in practice, it fully embodied the underlying snack philosophy of the era completely. A self-contained, carefully individually portioned combination of several small foods arranged together in a plastic tray, requiring no meaningful preparation, no utensils of any kind, and no involvement whatsoever from any adult beyond the initial purchase. Children genuinely loved this particular product because it felt fun and required essentially zero adult participation to enjoy. Parents, for entirely different and equally understandable reasons, bought it regularly because it was simply easy. The fact that its overall nutritional content was fairly modest, and that its sodium content was, by most measures, quite aggressive, was something pediatricians of the era occasionally noted with some concern, and something that was, in practice, almost universally overlooked by everyone else involved, because the underlying practical outcome was that the child was reliably eating something, and was not actively asking any adult for further help with the process. A particular gummy fruit snack featuring a liquid center arrived on shelves in 1991 and introduced a genuinely novel sensory experience to children across the country, biting into what looked like an ordinary gummy candy, and instead encountering a small, sudden burst of aggressively sweet liquid filling inside. These proved immediately and enormously popular with children, and were viewed with a certain measure of mild horror by parents who had personally been splashed while nearby. A separate product, cookie-shaped animal crackers designed specifically for dipping into a small attached container of frosting, launched that same year, originally in Canada before reaching the American market shortly afterward, and represented a snack so transparently formatted like a small dessert that it remains, in retrospect, fairly remarkable that it was marketed and sold, with apparent sincerity, as an appropriate item for a child's ordinary lunchbox. The underlying flavor engineering behind these 1990s snack products deserves genuine acknowledgement in its own right, because it turned out to be considerably more sophisticated than it initially appeared to most consumers at the time. Careful research eventually demonstrated that a very specific combination of salt, fat, and sugar, deployed together in precisely calibrated ratios, produces what food scientists refer to as hyperpalatability, a food experience so finely tuned to fundamental human sensory preferences that it effectively bypasses the body's ordinary satiety signals and encourages continued eating well past the actual point of genuine hunger. This effect was never accidental. Food companies of this era employed dedicated flavor chemists, conducted extensive rounds of consumer taste testing, and methodically iterated on their formulas until they hit precisely the specific combination that produced the very least resistance to continued, repeated consumption. This particular target, formally identified and named by food industry researcher Howard Moskowitz, became known within the industry as the bliss point. The snack industry of this decade had, in a very real and measurable sense, located that bliss point with real precision, and was manufacturing directly toward it, again and again, with increasing accuracy. The snack aisle itself grew steadily throughout the decade. The overall snack section expanded considerably in total floor space. New individual products proliferated at a rate that, by the end of the decade, made even the notoriously crowded cereal aisle look relatively restrained by comparison. By the late 1990s, the average American supermarket stocked several hundred genuinely distinct snack products, each one occupying carefully purchased shelf space, deliberately positioned at specific heights calibrated to reach different target audiences, and packaged using visual design specifically optimized to be noticed even in a shopper's peripheral vision while walking briskly down the aisle. The American snack food industry had become, by any reasonable measure, an industry of genuinely extraordinary sophistication, devoted almost entirely to a single underlying proposition: that there was simply no moment in the ordinary day that couldn't be meaningfully improved by eating something that arrived inside a small, crinkly bag. This particular proposition proved, at least from a purely commercial standpoint, to be entirely correct, and it has not been seriously challenged since. In 1994, a federal law known as the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act went into full effect across the country, requiring standardized nutrition fact panels on nearly all packaged food products sold in American grocery stores. And there they suddenly were, on essentially every box and can and bag: total calories, fat content measured in grams, sodium levels, and serving sizes that, upon closer inspection, often bore a fairly complicated and somewhat strained relationship with how people actually ate in practice. The American grocery shopper was now, for the first time in the country's history, formally armed with a genuinely standardized set of nutritional information. What individual shoppers actually chose to do with that new information, however, varied enormously from person to person. Some became genuinely meticulous label readers, comparing competing products side by side with the focused, careful intensity of a forensic accountant reviewing a set of financial statements. Others glanced briefly at the panel, saw a number that seemed reasonably manageable on its face, quietly decided that 2 full servings was, for practical purposes, essentially equivalent to 1 single serving, and simply moved on with the rest of their day. The broader push toward mandatory nutrition labeling of this kind had actually been building steadily for several decades before finally becoming law. The federal government had required basic ingredient labeling on packaged food since as far back as the 1930s, meaning manufacturers had long been required to list a product's actual contents in descending order by total weight. But detailed calorie counts and full nutrient breakdowns had remained entirely voluntary for most products right up until the 1990s, meaning that unless a particular company specifically chose to include that information on its own initiative, usually only when the resulting numbers happened to be genuinely flattering, the average consumer had no standardized, reliable way to understand what they were actually eating in any real nutritional terms. You could generally see what was inside a given food product. You had no consistent way of knowing how much of anything it actually contained, or what that specific quantity might reasonably mean for your own health over time. The process of actually developing this new standardized nutrition fact panel was neither quick nor especially simple in practice. The Federal Food and Drug Administration solicited extensive public comment, conducted considerable original consumer research, negotiated at length with representatives of the broader food industry over precise definitions and appropriate serving sizes, and eventually produced a final standardized format that attempted to carefully balance genuine comprehensiveness against real, everyday readability for an ordinary shopper standing in a grocery aisle. The resulting panel, built around a simple white background with clear black text, featuring bold headers specifically highlighting total calories and the most nutritionally significant individual items, along with a complete list of macronutrients and a selection of key micronutrients, represented a genuinely thoughtful design achievement in its own right. Though the specific serving size line positioned near the very top of the panel would go on to become, almost immediately, its single most contentious and widely criticized individual element, the underlying serving size problem was, in practice, fairly straightforward to understand once explained. Federal regulations required that stated serving sizes reasonably reflect the amount of a given product that people genuinely, typically consumed in one sitting. But individual food companies retained considerable practical latitude in actually defining what typical meant for their own specific product. A standard serving of potato chips, for instance, was typically defined on the label as roughly 1 ounce, or somewhere around 12 to 15 individual chips, a specific quantity that appears, upon closer examination, to have been selected largely because it produced a final calorie number that read as reasonably unalarming to the average shopper glancing at the label. In practice, essentially nobody has ever actually eaten only 12 potato chips in one sitting. The bag itself very clearly does not contain just one single serving by any reasonable measure. Everyone involved, including the manufacturer, generally understands perfectly well that the bag does not contain one serving. The official serving size printed on the nutrition panel and the actual serving sizes genuinely consumed by real shoppers existed throughout this entire era, in two entirely separate practical realities that maintained a kind of polite, unspoken mutual awareness of one another without ever quite making genuine direct contact. Despite this particular tension, the new nutrition label did produce real, measurable behavioral change among certain specific consumer segments. People managing particular diagnosed health conditions, including diabetes, hypertension, and various forms of cardiovascular disease, used the newly available information directly and quite meaningfully in their daily food decisions. Parents consulting these labels while shopping specifically for their children's food made decisions genuinely informed by the sodium and sugar figures in ways that simply hadn't been consistently possible before this law took effect. The already substantial diet and weight loss market, which had existed in various forms for decades, now had access to a standardized numerical language that allowed careful calorie counting to become a considerably more precise and more widely practiced everyday activity across the country. The new label also changed the broader grocery store experience in a somewhat subtler, less immediately obvious way. It made the various health claims printed prominently on the front of a package genuinely checkable for the first time. A product boldly claiming to be heart-healthy or low-fat directly on its front label could now be reasonably evaluated by any curious shopper against the actual detailed numbers printed on the back. This development did not, in practice, stop food companies from continuing to make somewhat misleading front-of-package marketing claims. But it did give ordinary consumers a genuinely useful new tool for basic skepticism that they simply hadn't reliably had access to before. The label represented a real, if modest, structural challenge to the food industry's existing marketing apparatus, not nearly sufficient on its own to fully overcome that apparatus, but real enough in practice to require genuine, ongoing adaptation. Products were gradually reformulated specifically to improve their resulting label numbers. Serving sizes were carefully engineered, with an eye toward the resulting calorie count. The front of the package and the back of the package effectively entered into a kind of quiet, ongoing negotiation that continues in essentially the same form right up to today, each one attempting to tell a somewhat different story about the very same underlying food product, with the individual consumer standing in the aisle left to decide, largely on their own, which particular story they were ultimately inclined to believe. By the late 1990s, and moving further into the early 2000s, something quietly interesting had begun happening across American cities on Saturday mornings. People were waking up early, entirely voluntarily, specifically to stand outdoors at a local market, and pay noticeably more than standard supermarket prices for vegetables that had been grown within a reasonably short drive of wherever they happened to be standing. The farmers' market itself was, of course, not any kind of genuinely new concept. It was, in fact, essentially how food had been sold across most of recorded human history, well before the modern supermarket ever existed. But its particular return to American cities during this period carried an entirely new layer of meaning attached to it: authenticity, a renewed sense of local community, and the quiet, genuine satisfaction that came specifically from handing money directly to an actual person, often wearing a weathered hat, who had personally grown the exact tomatoes now sitting in your hands. This was shopping reframed, quite explicitly, as a kind of ethics. It was, in a very real sense, lettuce functioning as a personal value statement. The farmer's market had never fully disappeared from American life, in the way this framing might suggest. Rural areas and smaller towns across the country had maintained versions of it with quiet, steady consistency throughout the many decades when the modern supermarket had come to dominate urban food culture more broadly. But the specific urban farmers market revival that took hold during the late 1990s was something genuinely different in overall character. A deliberate, values-driven return to direct food purchasing led primarily by a demographic that had grown up entirely within the supermarket era and was now, well into their 30s and 40s, beginning to seriously question what exactly that broader industrial system might have quietly cost along the way. According to figures compiled by the United States Department of Agriculture, there were approximately 1,700 farmers markets operating across the entire country back in 1994. By 2014, that number had grown to well over 8,000. That kind of sustained growth is not simply a passing trend. That is a genuine, sustained cultural movement. The underlying timing of this particular revival was not, in any real sense, coincidental. The 1990s had brought the very first wave of serious industrial food exposés into genuine mainstream public consciousness. An influential investigative book examining the fast food industry would not actually be published until 2001, but its various precursors, serious investigative journalism covering factory farming practices, food safety scandals, and a steadily growing body of published research on agricultural consolidation, had already been accumulating steadily throughout the late 1990s, finding a genuinely receptive audience of readers who were, by that point, ready and willing to be seriously troubled by what they were learning. A widely publicized E. coli contamination outbreak linked to a major fast food chain in 1993, which tragically killed 4 children and sickened several hundred additional people, had introduced the broader concept of industrial food contamination directly to a great many people who had genuinely never previously given any real thought to where their hamburger had actually come from. Thinking about that question seriously, for the first time, produced a set of uncomfortable feelings that the farmers' market experience was, quite specifically, well positioned to help address. The farmers' market offered a genuine counter-narrative to essentially every anxiety the broader industrial food system had generated over the preceding decades. Where the conventional supermarket offered real abundance but very little underlying transparency, you could, after all, buy a fresh tomato in the dead of January with no real way of knowing where it had actually come from, how long ago it had originally been picked, or what precisely had been done to it during the long journey in between. The farmers' market instead offered genuine visibility into the entire process. You could simply ask the person actually selling you the tomato exactly when it had been picked, because that specific person was standing directly in front of you. This was not merely practically useful information. It was, for a great many shoppers, genuinely emotionally satisfying in a way that the conventional supermarket, for all of its carefully engineered pleasures, had simply never been able to fully replicate. The price premium involved was real and often quite significant, and it sorted the overall farmers' market customer base in ways that many of the movement's more genuinely idealistic participants found somewhat uncomfortable to openly acknowledge. Heirloom tomatoes priced at $4 a pound, pasture-raised eggs priced at $7 a dozen, artisan bread priced at $9 a single loaf. These particular prices were simply not accessible to a great many households, and the overall demographics of a typical urban farmers market, generally skewing predominantly white and predominantly middle to upper income, reflected that underlying access gap fairly clearly to anyone paying attention. The broader argument that genuinely local and sustainable food ought to be reasonably accessible to absolutely everyone, regardless of income, was made frequently and quite sincerely throughout this period. The deeper structural conditions that made such food genuinely expensive to produce and sell, however, proved considerably slower to meaningfully change than the surrounding public sentiment about wanting to change them. What the broader farmers' market movement did successfully achieve, well beyond its own immediate shopping audience, was a lasting shift in the general vocabulary surrounding American food retail more broadly. Terms that had previously occupied a fairly marginal position in everyday conversation, local, seasonal, heirloom, pasture-raised, small batch, entered the broader mainstream of American food marketing directly through the farmers' market movement, and eventually migrated steadily outward into conventional supermarket shelving, restaurant menus, and fast casual restaurant chains that clearly understood the underlying aspiration these words represented, even when they couldn't always fully deliver on the substance behind them. The farmers' market never managed to fully fix the broader food system on its own, but it did successfully remind a great many people that a genuinely different system was possible, and that particular reminder turned out to carry real commercial consequences that ultimately reached considerably further than the roughly 8,000 individual Saturday morning markets it had directly produced. At some point during the late 1990s, the conventional modern supermarket quietly added something new that fundamentally changed the underlying premise of the entire grocery shopping trip. A hot food bar, a dedicated deli case stocked full of already fully cooked meals. A rotisserie chicken that was genuinely ready to eat right now, warm and golden, requiring absolutely no further preparation, no real planning ahead, nothing beyond the simple willingness to be the specific kind of person who buys a rotisserie chicken at 5:45 on an ordinary Tuesday evening and confidently calls it dinner. And America, as it turned out, was entirely and enthusiastically that kind of person. The prepared food section of the average supermarket grew steadily. The overall rate of regular home cooking, measured across the population, correspondingly fell. Nobody made any kind of formal public announcement about this shift, but everyone involved seemed to understand the basic underlying arrangement well enough. This particular prepared foods section did not, of course, arrive without any real precedent. Supermarket deli counters had already been offering cold cuts, prepared salads, and sliced cheese since as far back as the 1950s. And some stores had offered various hot prepared foods since at least the 1970s. But the full-scale prepared foods department as we would recognize it today, featuring multiple distinct hot food stations, a dedicated soup station, a full salad bar, sushi prepared fresh on-site, various roasted and rotisserie meats, and the strong implicit promise that a shopper could walk out of an ordinary grocery store carrying a genuinely complete dinner without ever having touched a single pan themselves, was very much a product of the 1990s specifically. Driven by a particular combination of factors that had been quietly building for years beforehand, time poverty stood as the primary underlying driver behind this entire shift. By the middle years of the 1990s, the dual-income household had firmly become the American norm rather than any kind of exception, and the ordinary question of who exactly was going to actually cook dinner on any given Wednesday night had become, for a great many families, genuinely complicated to answer. Both adults in the household had typically worked a full day. Children often had their own scheduled activities to attend. The straightforward answer that the original television dinner had proposed back in the 1950s, simply eat something reheated from a box, had certainly worked reasonably well for decades, but was proving increasingly unsatisfying to a newer generation that had grown up watching dedicated food television programming and had developed genuine, informed opinions about overall food quality. The prepared food section offered a meaningful third option that had previously been largely missing from the equation entirely. Genuinely real food, properly cooked by someone else, requiring nothing further from the shopper beyond their money, and at most, a microwave-safe container for reheating. The rotisserie chicken became the clear emblem of this particular broader compromise, because it was, by nearly every objective measure available, a genuinely good product in its own right. A whole chicken, slowly rotated over direct heat, until the skin turned properly crisp, and the meat underneath remained genuinely juicy, seasoned with a simple blend of herbs and salt, sold at a price generally competitive with simply buying an equivalent raw chicken and cooking it yourself at home, a process that would typically require at least one additional hour of active effort and would reliably produce a sink full of dirty dishes to clean up afterward. The underlying calculation was, for a great many households, simply not especially difficult. Supermarkets themselves had discovered that the rotisserie chicken functioned remarkably well as a genuine traffic driver, a specific purchase that reliably brought shoppers into the store with a clear, focused intention of buying it, and then kept those same shoppers browsing and purchasing additional items elsewhere in the store while they were already there. The chicken itself, in a very real financial sense, was doing considerably more overall work for the store than its modest individual price tag might otherwise suggest. The broader hot food bar itself expanded steadily over time to include items that tracked closely with prevailing food trend cycles, and did so with genuinely impressive responsiveness. In the early 2000s, a typical hot bar was likely to feature a dedicated pasta station, a carved meat option, and several dishes built around rich cream sauces. By the 2010s, that same hot bar had typically expanded further to include grain bowls, roasted seasonal vegetables, and specific options clearly labeled according to the particular dietary category. They were designed to serve vegan, gluten-free, paleo, because the average shopper visiting that hot bar had, by that point, developed a fairly specific set of nutritional identities that the bar itself was now expected to reliably accommodate. The prepared food section, in this broader sense, was never really selling pure convenience alone. It was selling a fairly convincing version of the exact meal you might well have cooked yourself, had you actually possessed the necessary time and energy that particular evening, carefully adapted to closely match whoever you currently believed yourself to be, nutritionally speaking. What the prepared food section quietly acknowledged in its own way was that regular daily cooking, once treated as an essentially universal requirement of ordinary household life, had genuinely become optional for any American family who could reasonably afford to make it optional. This represented a fairly significant cultural shift compared to even 30 years earlier, when the basic expectation that someone within a given household would reliably cook dinner most nights of the week had been treated as something close to a universal norm. This particular shift did not happen dramatically or all at once. It happened gradually, one rotisserie chicken at a time, one ordinary Wednesday evening at a time, until the prepared foods department had quietly become one of the highest margin sections in the entire store, and the broader question of whether someone within a given household actually cooked on a regular basis had genuinely shifted categories, from a basic domestic obligation into something closer to an optional lifestyle choice. The kitchen itself, notably, was still there in every one of these homes. It simply wasn't always strictly necessary anymore. Somewhere around 2012, something unusual happened to a particular protein that had been quietly present in wheat-based products for something close to 10,000 years, minding its own business without much controversy. Gluten, seemingly overnight, became, depending entirely on who you happen to ask, either a genuinely serious medical concern or something closer to a broad personality trait adopted by a significant portion of the population. For the roughly 1% of Americans formally diagnosed with celiac disease, an autoimmune condition in which gluten triggers a genuine, damaging immune response inside the small intestine, the wider availability of gluten-free products represented something authentically life-changing. For the considerably larger number of Americans who had simply read something concerning online and developed a vague but persistent sense of worry, the gluten-free section of the grocery store became something closer to a genuine destination in its own right. Grocery stores responded to this rapidly growing demand by expanding their overall offerings substantially, labeling a wide range of products as gluten-free that had, in truth, never contained any gluten in the first place and never realistically could have, and developing an entirely new descriptive vocabulary for bread that, by more than a few honest accounts, tasted mostly like a distant, somewhat wistful memory of actual bread. Celiac disease itself, the underlying autoimmune condition in which gluten, the specific protein found in wheat, barley, and rye, provokes a genuine immune response that gradually damages the lining of the small intestine, had actually been reasonably well understood within mainstream medicine since as far back as the 1940s, and had long supported a genuine patient population who required gluten-free food purely for legitimate medical reasons. For most of the 20th century, eating gluten-free as a celiac patient meant extremely careful, vigilant label reading, a fairly limited range of available food options, and an overall diet that demanded considerable advanced planning, and quite often, the occasional sacrifice of genuine enjoyment at mealtime. The gluten-free products that did exist during this earlier period were largely functional rather than genuinely pleasurable to eat. Dense breads made primarily from rice flour, crackers that tended to crumble apart almost preemptively before you'd even taken a bite, pasta that achieved a texture perhaps best described, charitably, as resigned. The broader shift that took hold around 2012 was not, in any meaningful sense, primarily driven by new medical findings. A separate and considerably more contested condition, generally referred to as non-celiac gluten sensitivity, in which people without a formal celiac diagnosis or any diagnosed wheat allergy nonetheless reported feeling noticeably better after eliminating gluten from their diet, had been described within certain corners of the medical literature and was subsequently being discussed, amplified, and steadily generalized across the broader wellness media landscape at a pace that considerably outpaced the actual underlying clinical evidence supporting it. Several popular books, carrying titles that strongly suggested ordinary wheat consumption was actively damaging the human brain, reached national bestseller lists during this period. Wellness bloggers documented their own personal gluten-free transformations in considerable detail, often describing dramatic before and after shifts in personal energy levels that read, to a skeptical outside observer, something close to a religious conversion narrative. The broader category exploded in popularity almost overnight. The food industry's own response to this rapidly growing trend was swift, commercially comprehensive, and in retrospect, genuinely impressive in its sheer scope. Gluten-free certification became a label that began appearing across essentially every conceivable product category on the shelf: bread, pasta, crackers, cookies, breakfast cereals, and eventually even products like plain bottled water and fresh raw vegetables, items that had never contained a single trace of wheat to begin with, and had never posed any realistic gluten risk to anyone under any circumstances. The labeling applied to these particular products was, strictly speaking, technically accurate in every case, while simultaneously being, in any practical sense, fairly absurd, a fairly direct consequence of marketing departments correctly recognizing that the gluten-free label itself had become a broadly understood shorthand for health conscious more generally, and was doing genuinely positive brand work for the product regardless of whether that specific product had any meaningful relationship whatsoever to actual gluten avoidance. Overall product quality did improve quite dramatically across this same general period, and that particular development represented the genuinely good news buried within this broader trend. The strong commercial incentive to produce gluten-free food that people actually wanted to eat by choice, rather than merely food that people with genuinely no other viable option were simply willing to tolerate out of medical necessity, produced real, measurable innovation in alternative flour technology. Bread made from carefully engineered blends of rice flour, tapioca starch, and xanthan gum became, for the first time, genuinely palatable to most people. Gluten-free pasta improved substantially from its earlier reputation for softened disappointment into something that could reasonably pass a fairly careful inspection, even if it still fell somewhat short in any direct side-by-side comparison against traditional wheat pasta. The existing patient population living with celiac disease, who had spent literal decades navigating a broader food system that had largely ignored their genuine needs, found their available options expanding rapidly as the considerably larger non-celiac market effectively funded the exact product development work that this smaller population had genuinely needed all along. The overall cultural peak of the gluten-free trend arrived somewhere around 2014 to 2016, after which it began a fairly slow, gradual retreat from its earlier position of total cultural dominance, though it certainly never disappeared entirely. It simply yielded its prominent front position within the broader wellness conversation to other emerging dietary anxieties that had, in effect, been quietly queuing up patiently behind it the entire time. The specific grocery store aisle that had reorganized itself so extensively around gluten-free products never fully reorganized back afterward. The individual products themselves remained meaningfully better formulated and considerably more numerous than they had ever been before this trend began, continuing to serve both a population that genuinely needed them for medical reasons and a somewhat larger population that simply preferred them by personal choice, or found the label itself reassuring for reasons that had little to do with any diagnosed medical condition. Gluten itself, in the end, quietly survived its particular moment of concentrated cultural notoriety and gradually returned to a state of relative quiet, still present in more or less the exact same range of products as before, still genuinely troublesome for roughly that same 1% of the overall population, and one imagines, likely fairly relieved that nobody appeared to be actively making documentaries specifically about it anymore. Now let's walk down a different aisle entirely, one that would have seemed almost entirely unrecognizable to a shopper from just a couple of decades earlier, the modern beverage aisle, and its full, complete transformation into a small taxonomy of wellness. Walk into the beverage section of a typical American supermarket sometime around 2018, and you would encounter something your own grandmother almost certainly would never have recognized as any kind of coherent product category. A section stretching 4 full feet or more, dedicated entirely to fermented tea available in a wide range of flavors, each individual bottle carrying detailed text about gut health, probiotic content, and a certain breezy, confident implication that simply drinking this particular beverage constituted a meaningful act of active self-improvement. This particular fermented tea sat alongside cold-pressed juices priced roughly like small personal investments, various adaptogenic drinks promising to help the body better manage stress, mushroom-infused coffee, and at least 2 or 3 distinct varieties of water that had each been enhanced, restructured, or otherwise meaningfully improved upon in ways that water's original, presumably fairly satisfied, designers had apparently entirely overlooked. The underlying beverage itself, kombucha, is genuinely ancient in origin, a fermented tea drink made using a symbiotic culture of specific bacteria and yeast, consumed in various forms across China as far back as roughly 220 BCE, and gradually spreading through Russia and various parts of Eastern Europe over the many centuries that followed. It arrived in American health food stores sometime during the 1990s, originally produced by dedicated home brewers and a handful of small independent producers, occupying much the same cultural niche as other fermented foods already beloved within the broader natural food community, carrying genuine nutritional content, requiring a somewhat acquired taste, and maintaining a small but genuinely devoted base of enthusiasts. The flavor itself is notably tart, faintly vinegary, gently effervescent, a specific combination that reads to different people as either genuinely refreshing or mildly alarming, depending largely on that particular person's overall relationship with the broader concept of fermentation. The commercial kombucha industry in the United States was essentially created almost single-handedly by one specific company, founded in 1995 by a young entrepreneur who credited his own mother's successful recovery from breast cancer, at least in part, to her regular consumption of kombucha. That original company began as a fairly small California-based producer and grew steadily through natural food retail channels over the following years. By the time the broader wellness trend of the 2010s reached its own full point of cultural saturation, this same company remained the dominant brand within a category that had, by that point, expanded to include dozens of active competitors, multiple distinct flavor lines, and a genuine shelf presence in conventional mainstream supermarkets that would have been entirely unimaginable just a decade earlier. The broader probiotic narrative sat at the very center of kombucha's eventual rise into the mainstream. The underlying science surrounding the human gut microbiome, the vast community of bacteria and other microorganisms living throughout the human digestive system, and influencing overall health in ways that researchers were, throughout this period, only just beginning to fully understand and map out, was steadily translating from fairly technical academic journals into everyday consumer consciousness across the 2010s. And that particular translation was not always especially precise or scientifically careful. The underlying microbiome research itself was genuinely interesting and genuinely complex in its details. The specific relationship between particular bacterial strains, particular measurable health outcomes, and particular consumer food products was rarely straightforward, and the actual scientific evidence supporting many specific probiotic product claims remained fairly limited. The surrounding marketing, however, was not meaningfully constrained by any of that underlying scientific complexity. Gut health became a consumer concept broad enough to comfortably encompass everything from ordinary yogurt to fermented vegetables to kombucha itself, and eventually to a rapidly growing line of dedicated dietary supplements, each one suggesting, in its own way, that your personal internal ecosystem genuinely needed active tending, and that this particular product happened to be exactly the right tool for that specific job. The separate cold-pressed juice category, which shared considerable shelf space with kombucha throughout this period, operated on a somewhat different but closely related underlying premise. The idea that meaningful nutrients could be efficiently extracted from whole fruits and vegetables, and then consumed in a concentrated liquid form, delivering health benefits, according to the marketing, considerably more efficiently than simply eating the original whole foods those nutrients had come from. Cold pressing itself, a specific extraction method using sustained hydraulic pressure rather than heat, was widely claimed to preserve meaningfully more nutrients than conventional juicing methods. The resulting products were, without question, genuinely expensive, with prices in the range of $8 to $12 for a single 16-ounce bottle becoming fairly standard across the category, and were consumed primarily by urban professionals who were either genuinely, sincerely committed to the underlying nutritional proposition, or who simply found the visually striking colored bottles and clean, minimal ingredient lists aesthetically consistent with how they preferred to see themselves. Both underlying motivations, from the perspective of the companies selling these juices, proved to be entirely commercially valid. The juice companies themselves, quite reasonably, never particularly inquired which motivation applied to any individual customer, what the fully developed kombucha shelf represented. At its broadest and most complete extent, was nothing less than the near-total colonization of the entire beverage aisle by a single overarching wellness concept. The underlying idea that whatever you chose to drink ought to be actively doing something meaningful for your body beyond simple hydration, that every single sip represented a fresh opportunity for personal optimization, and that plain, ordinary water, while technically sufficient on a purely biological level, was nonetheless quietly leaving some meaningful degree of potential improvement sitting on the table, unclaimed. The beverage aisle that had, for decades, offered a fairly simple selection of soda, juice, water, and sports drinks now offered instead an elaborate taxonomy of specifically functional beverages, carefully organized according to whatever particular aspect of the body or mind each one specifically claimed to improve. Your gut, your energy levels, your mental focus, your body's stress response, your quality of sleep. All of it, according to the surrounding marketing, fully addressable, all of it conveniently available inside a single bottle, all of it ready and waiting to be placed into your cart as visible, tangible evidence that you were genuinely taking your own health seriously. Whether any of it actually, measurably worked remained, in most individual cases, a genuinely open question best left to researchers. Whether it reliably sold, however, was a question that had already been answered quite clearly by the sales figures themselves. Now we arrive at March of 2020, a moment that reshaped the American grocery store more suddenly and more visibly than almost anything since the original post-war supermarket boom itself. In March of that year, Americans went to their local grocery stores in a way they genuinely never had before, carrying real urgency, real fear, and a sudden, deeply held conviction that their household needed to acquire an amount of toilet paper that bore essentially no rational relationship whatsoever to the actual number of people living under their own roof. The pandemic grocery run quickly became a defining cultural event of the period, a kind of collective snapshot of national anxiety rendered visible in the specific contents of a shopping cart. Dried beans, a genuinely humble pantry staple that had sat largely unnoticed for decades, disappeared from store shelves virtually overnight. Baking yeast became something close to a controlled substance, nearly impossible to find in stock anywhere. Flour was hoarded in genuinely enormous quantities. And then, in the weeks that followed this initial wave of panic buying, something quietly interesting began happening. Americans, suddenly confined largely to their own homes, began cooking. Actually cooking, genuinely from scratch, often using the very same flour they had just anxiously stockpiled. And a meaningful number of them, for the first time in years, or in some cases for the very first time in their entire adult lives, discovered that they genuinely enjoyed it. The initial wave of panic buying in March of 2020 was driven by a fairly specific, and not entirely irrational, underlying fear that broader supply chains might genuinely break down under the strain, that stores might actually run out of essential goods, and that the ordinary, largely taken for granted abundance of the typical American supermarket was, in reality, considerably more fragile than it had ever appeared during normal times. This particular fear was, in a genuinely understandable way, and in certain limited respects, actually correct. Supply chains did experience real, measurable disruptions during this period. Certain specific products did become genuinely scarce for a time, but the actual buying behavior this fear triggered bore, in practice, fairly little relationship to the real, underlying probability of any genuine shortage. Toilet paper specifically, a product manufactured almost entirely domestically, and never actually facing any meaningful underlying supply constraint, disappeared from shelves simply because a large number of households all decided to buy meaningfully extra quantities at more or less the exact same time. A genuinely self-fulfilling prophecy of scarcity, created entirely by the shared anticipation of scarcity itself. The shelves went empty specifically because everyone was afraid the shelves would go empty. A fairly striking sentence that captures something genuinely essential about collective human behavior under conditions of acute, shared stress. The particular flour shortage of this same period was, in some ways, considerably more interesting than the toilet paper shortage, because it revealed something quite specific about how Americans had, over the preceding decades, gradually reorganized their entire relationship with home cooking. Flour itself had, in fact, been quietly available on ordinary grocery store shelves in essentially unlimited quantities for decades, largely because most Americans, by that point, simply weren't doing much regular home baking at all. Commercial bread production had, over the preceding several generations, replaced home baking so thoroughly and so completely that the average American household consumed flour almost entirely through various purchased finished products, and used remarkably little of the actual raw ingredient directly in any given year. When the pandemic effectively removed the ordinary option of eating out or picking up prepared food, while simultaneously providing a large amount of previously non-existent free time, a genuinely significant number of Americans discovered, seemingly all at once, that they wanted to bake bread from scratch, which naturally requires flour, which, in turn, simply hadn't been stocked in sufficient quantities to serve an entire population that had collectively and simultaneously decided to take up home baking within the very same few weeks. The sourdough bread boom of this period became, without much competition, the single most thoroughly documented expression of this broader shift. Sourdough bread, which requires the ongoing maintenance of a genuinely live starter culture built from wild yeast and naturally occurring bacteria, demands real time, real sustained attention, and a fairly high tolerance for the somewhat unpredictable behavior of what is, in effect, a small living fermentation project sitting on your kitchen counter. This was, in nearly every meaningful respect, precisely the kind of slow, deliberately process-oriented cooking activity that the preceding 30 years of American food culture had been steadily, systematically designing out of most people's everyday lives. In the spring of 2020, with nowhere in particular to go, and, quite suddenly, considerably more time than usual on their hands, Americans across the country began making sourdough starters. They fed them faithfully every single day. Many gave them individual names. They photographed their finished loaves and shared them widely on social media, carrying a genuine sense of pride that would have been entirely recognizable to a 1950s housewife presenting a particularly successful casserole to her own dinner guests, even though the surrounding aesthetic language had, of course, changed quite considerably in the decades between. The grocery store itself, throughout this particular period, became a genuinely strange and visibly altered environment. Shoppers wearing masks. Directional arrows taped carefully onto the floor to guide foot traffic in one consistent direction. Clear plexiglass barriers installed at every checkout station. Entire sections sitting conspicuously empty where paper products and various dried goods had previously been fully stocked, standing right alongside other sections that remained entirely full of items nobody had felt any particular urge to panic by at all. There was, notably, still plenty of saffron available on the shelf throughout this entire period. The kumquat display, similarly, remained almost entirely untouched. Fresh pasta had, for whatever reason, been largely overlooked by panicked shoppers entirely. The specific items that vanished from shelves during this period revealed a fairly telling portrait of collective national anxiety, precisely what people believed, on some instinctive level, they genuinely needed in order to feel secure when everything else around them felt deeply uncertain. And the items that remained fully stocked and largely untouched revealed in their own quiet way exactly what people simply hadn't thought to fear in the first place, which was, in its own right, equally telling. What genuinely endured well after the immediate crisis period eventually passed was a modest but entirely real shift in overall home cooking rates, a shift that food researchers went on to carefully document across the following several years. The pandemic had, in effect, reintroduced daily cooking as a genuine everyday practice to a great many households that had largely abandoned it over the preceding decades. And a meaningful number of those same households, having rediscovered the specific satisfaction that comes from making something genuinely from scratch with their own hands, did not fully abandon that practice again once ordinary life resumed. The individual sourdough starters themselves, for the most part, eventually died off from simple neglect. The broader underlying impulse that had led people to create them in the first place did not entirely disappear along with them, and the grocery store's flour aisle, once it finally returned to its previous state of full, entirely unremarkable, everyday supply, was never again quite taken for granted in the exact same way it had been before. Grocery delivery, it is worth noting clearly, was never actually a pandemic-era invention in any real sense. A company offering online grocery delivery had been operating in the United States since as far back as 1989. But the specific years surrounding 2020 accelerated its broader adoption in ways that no marketing budget, however large, could ever have realistically achieved on its own. Suddenly, the underlying proposition of actually driving to a physical store, walking through that store in person, and then physically returning home carrying your own groceries began to feel, for a genuinely significant number of Americans, like an unnecessarily elaborate and entirely optional activity that they were now fully prepared to skip indefinitely if given the choice. Grocery delivery, grocery curbside pickup, various dedicated curbside service programs. The modern supermarket had spent close to a full century carefully, deliberately designing itself to function as a genuine physical destination. And now, quite suddenly, a large portion of its own customer base was politely but firmly deciding that they would, in fact, prefer for the supermarket to come directly to them instead. That original 1989 grocery delivery service had been, in its own way, genuinely visionary, and also, in roughly equal measure, commercially premature for the era in which it launched. The underlying technological infrastructure required to support online grocery ordering back in the late 1980s, slow dial-up internet connections, no standardized e-commerce payment systems of any kind, and fairly limited household computer ownership overall, made the resulting service genuinely difficult for most customers to actually use, and correspondingly expensive for the company itself to operate at any real scale. That original company managed to survive throughout the 1990s, primarily by serving a fairly narrow demographic of busy urban professionals who found the added premium genuinely worth paying for the convenience involved. And it demonstrated fairly clearly, even at that early stage, that real underlying consumer demand for this kind of service genuinely existed, even when the surrounding technology itself remained largely inadequate to fully support it. The broader internet boom of the late 1990s brought several new competitors into this same general space, most notably one particularly ambitious company that launched in 1999, backed by an enormous amount of venture capital funding, promising to entirely transform grocery retail as a category, and operating according to a business model that ultimately expanded considerably faster than its own underlying unit economics could realistically support. That company filed for bankruptcy in 2001, taking an estimated $250 million in invested capital down along with it, and the broader grocery delivery category as a whole subsequently spent much of the following decade in a fairly quiet period of noticeably reduced ambition. A major technology company's acquisition of the natural food chain discussed earlier, completed in 2017, served as the clear signal that this particular quiet period was finally beginning to end. The resulting combination of that company's extensive existing logistics infrastructure and the natural food chain's substantial retail footprint created, for the first time, a genuinely credible pathway toward grocery delivery operating at real national scale, and the competitive response from established, conventional supermarket chains was more or less immediate. One prominent grocery delivery platform, founded in 2012, specifically as a service connecting individual gig economy shoppers with existing physical stores who would shop on a customer's behalf and then deliver the resulting order directly, had already been growing steadily before this point, and its growth accelerated dramatically afterward. Major national retailers launched their own dedicated grocery pickup programs. Other large grocery chains formed direct partnerships with existing delivery services. The broader grocery delivery race that had first been quietly started back in 1989 was, after 3 full decades, finally attracting the level of capital investment and logistics infrastructure it had genuinely required all along. The pandemic itself effectively removed the very last remaining source of friction holding this broader shift back. Going to the physical grocery store had, of course, never been a purely practical act to begin with, even in ordinary times. It had also always been, at the same time, a genuine social occasion, a distinct sensory experience, and a small, welcome break in the ordinary rhythm of a person's day. The pandemic made that particular social element genuinely hazardous for a time, and made the underlying sensory experience of being in a crowded indoor space feel actively alarming to a great many people. And grocery delivery, which had previously appealed mainly to people with genuinely very limited available time, now appealed instead to a much broader population, including plenty of people who technically had all the time in the world available to them, but simply preferred, quite reasonably under the circumstances, not to stand in close proximity to strangers inside an enclosed indoor space. Adoption rates for delivery services jumped noticeably across demographic groups that had previously resisted the format entirely. Older adults who had genuinely never shopped online before in their lives learned to navigate these unfamiliar delivery apps and interfaces. People who had previously considered grocery delivery to be something of an unnecessary luxury quietly normalized it instead as a perfectly standard, unremarkable option. It is genuinely worth considering, for a moment, exactly what this broader shift toward delivery did to the grocery store as a physical, lived experience. The stores that generations of supermarket designers had spent literal decades carefully, deliberately engineering, the produce section positioned right at the entrance, the dairy case placed deliberately at the very back, the bread smell diffusing carefully outward from the in-store bakery, the end cap displays positioned precisely for maximum impulse purchasing impact, had all been meticulously designed for one very specific kind of human interaction. Physically present, walking through the space, engaging all the senses at once, and genuinely subject to the store's carefully arranged environmental cues throughout the entire trip. The delivery shopper, almost entirely, bypasses all of it. They never smell the bread. They never physically pass the end cap displays. They are never gently slowed down by background music specifically calibrated to reduce their overall walking speed through the aisles. They simply submit a list through an app and sometime later receive a box. The store's entire, carefully constructed apparatus of gentle persuasion is, quite simply, no longer present in the room at all. Whether this particular shift represents a genuine kind of liberation or a real, if quiet, kind of loss depends considerably on your own individual perspective. The physical grocery store had functioned, in more than a few real ways, as a genuine community space, the kind of place easy enough to overlook entirely, right up until it suddenly wasn't reliably available in quite the same way anymore. A place where you might run into a neighbor unexpectedly, where you made 100 small, ordinary decisions each week about what your household was actually going to eat, and where the underlying rhythm of shopping itself was also, in a very real sense, the rhythm of providing consistently for yourself and for the people who depended on you. The delivery app provides the food itself without much of that surrounding experience attached to it. It is efficient in more or less exactly the same way a vending machine is efficient, and it produces, in the end, a broadly similar quality of overall transaction. Complete, genuinely convenient, and largely stripped entirely of the small, accidental pleasures that the physical store, for all of its carefully engineered manipulation, had nonetheless always managed to provide alongside everything else. There is a well-documented psychological phenomenon known within behavioral research as choice overload, And the modern American grocery store stands as something close to its single most natural, fully realized habitat. Multiple careful studies have found that when people are presented with too many available options at once, they tend to buy noticeably less overall, decide more slowly than they otherwise would, and perhaps most tellingly, report feeling genuinely worse about whatever specific choice they eventually did make. The average American supermarket by the 2010s typically carried somewhere between 30 and 50,000 entirely distinct individual products at any given time. The cereal aisle alone, considering breakfast cereal specifically and nothing else, might reasonably offer something in the range of 80 separate options for a shopper to choose between. The yogurt case, on its own, could genuinely consume a meaningful portion of an ordinary afternoon if you attempted to carefully evaluate every single available option. At some point along this steady trajectory, the original promise of pure abundance began to feel, for a great many shoppers, considerably less like genuine freedom and more like an unfinished homework assignment they hadn't adequately prepared for, one where you simply needed anyone, to reasonably tell you which specific granola to buy so that you could finally go home. The specific research that first formally named this particular phenomenon was conducted by psychologists Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper in a widely cited study published in the year 2000, commonly referred to afterward within the field as simply the jam study. At an upscale gourmet food store, the two researchers set up a dedicated tasting booth offering shoppers either 6 distinct varieties of jam or, on alternating days, 24 distinct varieties, and carefully measured both how many individual shoppers stopped to sample the jam and how many of those shoppers ultimately went on to actually purchase a jar. The booth, offering 24 varieties, reliably attracted considerably more visitors overall. A wider range of available options simply seemed more interesting to passing shoppers on its face. But the booth, offering only 6 carefully selected varieties, ultimately produced roughly 10 times more actual purchases than its more elaborate counterpart. When faced with too many available choices at once, people quite reliably found the underlying decision itself genuinely harder to make, reported feeling noticeably less satisfied afterward with whichever choice they did eventually settle on, and quite often simply chose to make no purchase decision at all rather than continue working through the process. The original study itself had been conducted using nothing more exotic than ordinary jam, but its broader implications radiated outward considerably, eventually touching essentially every single aisle of every grocery store across the entire country, nearly all of which had, up to that point, been operating on the largely unexamined assumption that more available variety was always, without exception, genuinely better for the shopper. The overall expansion of grocery product variety had, in fact, been continuous and steadily accelerating since roughly the 1980s onward. New individual food products launched by the broader food industry numbered reliably in the tens of thousands every single year throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, and the clear majority of them represented simple line extensions, new flavors, new package sizes, new minor formulations of already existing products, rather than any genuinely new product category emerging from scratch. The ordinary yogurt aisle, to take one especially clear example, expanded considerably over these same decades from a fairly modest handful of basic available varieties into an elaborate, sprawling taxonomy. Full-fat, low-fat, non-fat, Greek-style, Icelandic-style, Australian-style, drinkable, squeezable, organic, conventionally produced, sweetened, unsweetened, and flavored across combinations ranging anywhere from simple strawberry all the way to birthday cake, and eventually to flavors that genuinely suggested some food scientist somewhere had been issued a direct personal dare. Each individual new variety, of course, required its own dedicated shelf space. Each individual new variety, correspondingly, required its own small additional decision from every single shopper passing by. The cumulative overall decision load involved in an entirely ordinary weekly grocery shopping trip had grown substantially heavier over these decades, without any single person or company ever explicitly, deliberately choosing to make that load meaningfully harder to carry. The response to this broader problem from certain corners of the food retail industry eventually took the form of a genuine counter-movement, one built specifically around the values of simplicity and deliberate curation, rather than sheer, unlimited variety. One particular grocery chain, which had actually been operating quietly in some form since the 1960s, but did not reach genuine widespread cultural saturation until the 2000s, built its entire underlying business model around a proposition that ran directly opposite to the conventional supermarket approach. Stocking somewhere around 4,000 total products, the clear majority of them sold under the store's own private label, each one carefully selected in advance by dedicated company buyers who had already made the underlying quality judgment on the shopper's behalf. You could not, at this particular store, choose freely between 15 different competing brands of peanut butter. You could simply buy the store's own house brand peanut butter, which the company itself had already determined was genuinely good, and that underlying decision, in a very real sense, had already been made for you well before you ever walked through the door. Customers responded to this particular approach with a level of genuine enthusiasm that, at times, bordered on outright devotion, and the long lines regularly forming outside any newly opened location of this chain have consistently ranked among the more sociologically interesting phenomena in all of modern American retail. The broader underlying lesson that this so-called 47 varieties problem ultimately teaches us about the American grocery store is one that the store's own original mid-century designers had never fully anticipated back when they were first constructing their great post-war cathedral of abundance. That raw abundance, entirely without any meaningful surrounding organization or curation, tends to produce genuine paralysis rather than satisfaction. That real freedom of choice in practice generally requires a genuinely manageable set of underlying options in order to actually function as freedom, rather than simply becoming an additional daily burden. And that what a great many shoppers ultimately want most, when it really comes down to it, is not necessarily more available options to choose from, but rather someone they already trust to have thoughtfully made at least some of that underlying selection process on their behalf in advance. The particular supermarket that managed to genuinely solve this problem, the one that offered real, meaningful variety while simultaneously reducing the overall cognitive cost involved in actually navigating that variety, was, in the end, simply the one that understood its own customers well enough to recognize that sometimes the single most genuinely valuable thing any grocery store can offer a shopper is exactly the specific item they originally came in looking for, clearly labeled, easy to actually locate, and not buried underneath 46 competing alternatives, all demanding equal consideration at the very same time. The first self-checkout machines began appearing inside American supermarkets sometime during the 1990s, and the ordinary grocery store checkout experience would genuinely never be quite the same again afterward. The underlying idea behind the technology was simple, frictionless efficiency. Scan each of your own items yourself, bag them yourself as you go, complete your payment without waiting in any staffed line, and leave the store with your basic dignity fully intact. The practical reality experienced by a great many ordinary American shoppers turned out to be something closer to an ongoing, low-grade negotiation with a machine that did not, in any meaningful sense, actually trust them. Unexpected item detected in the bagging area. Please wait for an available attendant. Have you successfully scanned your store loyalty card yet? The self-checkout system did not, in practice, so much replace the traditional staffed checkout line as it quietly replaced that line with a somewhat more stressful, more personally accountable checkout process, overseen throughout by a machine carrying evident trust issues and roughly the patience of an especially humorless government bureaucrat. The very first commercially deployed self-checkout system in the United States was installed back in 1986 at a single Kroger location in Atlanta, built and operated by a company called Optimal Robotics. It was, by most contemporary accounts, fairly slow, occasionally genuinely bewildering to use, and still required a dedicated staff member standing nearby at all times to assist confused customers, a requirement that rather significantly undermined the entire underlying efficiency proposition being sold. The underlying technology gradually improved throughout the 1990s, and by the early 2000s, dedicated self-checkout lanes had become a genuinely standard feature across most major American supermarket chains, actively promoted at the time as a meaningful labor-saving innovation that would reliably reduce overall customer wait times and improve the broader shopping experience specifically for customers who generally preferred to avoid direct human interaction at the checkout register. A particular preference that turned out, in practice, to be considerably more widely shared across the population than anyone had explicitly predicted beforehand. The bagging area weight sensor stands as the self-checkout system's single most memorable and lasting contribution to broader American everyday stress culture. Originally designed specifically to help prevent theft by confirming that the measured weight of whatever item a customer placed into the bagging area matched the expected weight already associated with the item they had just scanned. The sensor produced false positive alerts with a frequency that strongly suggests its original calibration had been set by someone who fully expected ordinary shoppers to behave both perfectly consistently and somewhat robotically at all times. The reusable canvas bag you happened to bring along from home carried its own inherent weight. The item you had just carefully scanned and then placed gently, but apparently not quite gently enough, into the bagging area had visibly disturbed the sensor's finely tuned equilibrium. The machine reliably noticed this disturbance. The machine promptly announced it. The machine then waited patiently, its small yellow warning light blinking steadily in the universal visual language of mild mechanical disappointment, for a designated attendant to eventually arrive and formally absolve you of whatever minor transgression had apparently just occurred. You had not, in reality, stolen anything at all. You had simply placed a cucumber into your bag in a manner the machine judged to be somehow incorrect, and that specific cucumber would now need to be manually verified before you could proceed. The individual attendant responsible for simultaneously overseeing anywhere from 6 to 8 separate self-checkout lanes at once became, in practice, one of the more quietly stressful entry-level positions across the entire American retail sector. Responsible for managing a fairly wide physical territory filled with constant minor emergencies, each one typically requiring either a manual key override or a specific password entry, along with a brief, often slightly awkward personal exchange with a customer who was, depending on the moment, either genuinely apologetic, visibly frustrated, or had simply stopped caring entirely and was now holding a cucumber up against the sensor with the flat, resigned expression of someone who has genuinely nothing left to lose in that particular moment. This particular position combined the ordinary social demands of frontline customer service with the more technical demands of basic machine troubleshooting and the considerable physical demands of covering a fairly large retail area quickly and continuously. All of it, quite notably, for approximately the same hourly wage as the traditional staffed cashier position. The self-checkout system had originally been introduced, at least in part, to help reduce the broader retail industry problem generally referred to as shrink, the standard industry term used to describe inventory losses stemming from theft of various kinds, became noticeably more complicated specifically in the context of self-checkout, in ways that academic researchers began carefully documenting throughout the 2010s. Multiple studies consistently found meaningfully higher overall loss rates specifically within self-checkout lanes, compared directly against traditionally staffed checkout lanes. A difference attributable to some combination of genuinely intentional theft, ordinary accidental scanning errors, and a fairly significant gray area of everyday customer behavior in which certain items simply went unscanned entirely, without the customer involved ever having clearly, consciously decided not to scan them in the first place. The self-checkout machine, in effect, created a subtly different moral environment for the average shopper than a human cashier traditionally had, one that felt noticeably less socially monitored in the moment, more individually self-directed, and calibrated in ways that appeared to make certain small, dishonest actions feel meaningfully less consequential than they likely would have felt under the direct, watchful gaze of an actual person standing right there. One prominent natural food chain removed self-checkout entirely from a significant number of its store locations in 2024, and several other major grocery chains subsequently began quietly reducing their own overall self-checkout capacity as well, following years of steady, largely unquestioned expansion. A fairly notable industry-wide correction that effectively acknowledged what these machines had never actually managed to fully deliver on in practice. The genuinely seamless, fast, and entirely frictionless checkout experience that had been the original core promise behind the entire technology from the very beginning. The self-checkout system had, in the end, meaningfully reduced overall labor costs for retailers, while effectively transferring a real, measurable amount of that labor directly onto the customer instead, broke down with real regularity, generated noticeably more everyday stress than the traditional staffed checkout line it had largely replaced, and contributed to an ongoing, mild but persistent shrink problem that ultimately required its own new layer of dedicated staffing to help manage. It was, in the end, something close to a genuine marvel of modern American retail problem-solving, a specific technology originally introduced to solve one clearly identified problem, which then went on to quietly create at least 3 new ones in its place, was subsequently adopted almost everywhere across the industry regardless, and has, more recently, been slowly and quietly retreating in certain locations, with remarkably few people involved fully, openly admitting exactly what had actually happened along the way. The American grocery store, taken as a whole across this entire long journey, has simply never managed to stay the same for very long at any point. It has expanded considerably. It has occasionally contracted. It has reorganized itself repeatedly, reinvented its own basic premise more than once, added a small wine bar in certain locations, installed self-checkout lanes, and then in some cases quietly removed those very same self-checkout lanes again. It spent the better part of an entire decade at one point genuinely trying to convince the American public that low-fat cheese was, on balance, a food product worth eating. Throughout all of it, the store has consistently reflected back nearly every major cultural anxiety and aspiration held by the broader society it exists specifically to serve. The deep post-war hunger for genuine abundance, the pointed nutritional fears of the 1970s about exactly what was hiding inside the food itself, the 1980s discovery that food could function as a genuine marker of social status, the 1990s explosion of near-constant snacking throughout the day, and our own present, somewhat uneasy coexistence with an entire wall of different oat milk varieties, alongside one particular man standing quietly in the chip aisle who has, by every visible indication, simply and fully given up. The long journey from the 1950s housewife carefully arranging herself in heels for a routine errand, to the 2023 shopper padding through the same aisles in worn pajama pants, is not, in any meaningful sense, primarily a story about simple cultural decline, even though it has certainly been told that particular way by more than a few observers over the years. It is, far more accurately, a story about ongoing renegotiation, a genuinely century-long, ongoing conversation between the American people and their own food supply, about what a shared meal actually means, about what level of effort is genuinely worth expending, about whose labor ultimately counts and is properly recognized, and about what particular kind of everyday life the modern grocery store is actually meant to support and sustain. The woman in heels, all those decades ago, was carefully performing a very specific, culturally defined version of competence inside a broader system that had already decided on her behalf exactly what competence was supposed to visibly look like. The person in pajamas today is performing something meaningfully different, a quiet refusal to treat an entirely routine errand as a mandatory social performance. A fairly casual, confident assertion that they possess enough basic self-possession to simply go out in public without any real need for armor, and enough genuine confidence to let the grocery store simply be exactly what it functionally is underneath everything else. A large building full of food, rather than a small theater in which they are somehow obligated to play a specific, predetermined role for an unseen audience. Both of these positions, in the end, represent genuine responses to more or less the exact same underlying question. What precisely do I actually owe the surrounding world when I go out to buy groceries? The honest answer to that question has clearly shifted quite considerably over these decades. The intense social surveillance that had once organized nearly every aspect of mid-century grocery shopping, where what you specifically chose to buy, and precisely how you looked while buying it, functioned as genuinely readable public information about exactly who you were and how well your household was actually doing, has, over the intervening decades, attenuated quite significantly. The relative anonymity of the modern supermarket, considerably larger now, generally busier, and staffed by employees who are, more often than not, simply too occupied with their own responsibilities to closely notice any individual shopper's chosen outfit, has effectively made that older kind of performance genuinely optional rather than mandatory. The continued rise of delivery services, meanwhile, has made it entirely avoidable altogether for those who choose that option. The modern shopper wearing pajamas to the store is not, in any meaningful sense, genuinely unaware of the broader social norms still technically in place around them. They have, whether consciously or not, quietly assessed the actual situation and reasonably concluded that this particular social norm simply carries no real, meaningful enforcement mechanism worth genuinely worrying about anymore. And, in a fairly straightforward practical sense, they happen to be entirely correct in that assessment. The grocery store has also, over these same decades, quietly become something close to a running, ongoing record of American health more broadly, and that particular record turns out to be genuinely complicated when examined closely and honestly. The prepared foods section and the frozen food aisle have, by any reasonable measure, never been larger than they currently are. The snack food section has never before offered quite so many available options to choose from. The average American household, according to widely cited research estimates, wastes something in the range of 30% of all the food it actually purchases in a given year, a genuinely striking statistic that represents an extraordinary quantity of money, of natural resources, and of accumulated human labor, contributed by every single person involved somewhere along the way in growing, processing, and eventually shipping food that ultimately ended up being thrown away entirely unused. These particular facts are not, in any real sense, separate or unrelated observations sitting side by side. They are all, in truth, different individual facets of the very same underlying story, one describing a broader food system that has become extraordinarily efficient at producing genuine abundance, while distributing that same abundance quite unevenly across the population. A system that has engineered genuine sensory pleasure with truly extraordinary skill and precision, while pursuing consistent nutritional quality with considerably less overall success. A system that has, by nearly any historical measure, made the basic act of feeding yourself and your family genuinely easier than at any previous point in all of recorded human history, and has, somehow, simultaneously made that same basic act more confusing than it has arguably ever been before. What the American grocery store has, underneath all of its careful engineering, its extensive marketing, its detailed nutrition panels, and its constantly rotating seasonal displays, consistently done throughout this entire long history, is hold up a fairly honest mirror directly in front of the people actually shopping inside it. The original post-war supermarket reflected back a nation genuinely flush with confident optimism and genuinely hungry for the broader promise of real, lasting material plenty. The health food panic of the 1980s reflected back a nation that had, by that point, begun seriously worrying about exactly what that same hard-won plenty had actually costed along the way. The specialty food era of that same general period reflected back a nation quietly discovering that what a person chose to eat could function as a genuine, meaningful form of personal self-expression. The rise of the modern delivery app more recently reflects back a nation that has grown comfortable enough with its own baseline abundance that it no longer feels any particular need to physically go out and personally retrieve it at all. The woman who once pushed a chrome-wheeled cart through the aisles back in 1955, dressed carefully in her very best dress, thoughtfully selecting her canned soup and her flavored gelatin powder with real, genuine care, was doing something entirely real and meaningful in that moment, providing steadily for her household, carefully navigating her own particular social world, and actively exercising the considerable skills and hard-won expertise that her specific life circumstances had allowed her to develop over time. The person rolling quietly into the store parking lot tonight, still in slippers, to pick up a rotisserie chicken and a bag of fancy chips and something reasonably green to help balance out that bag of chips, is likewise doing something entirely real in their own way. The store either one of them walks into is now considerably bigger, noticeably louder, more genuinely overwhelming in its sheer scale, far better stocked than it has ever been, and in more than a few honest respects, considerably more confusing to navigate. But the underlying hunger that particular store is ultimately trying to satisfy, for reliable food, for a bit of genuine ease in an otherwise busy day, for some quiet sense that the coming week is broadly manageable and that dinner will, somehow, reliably happen, remains at its core, more or less exactly the same as it has always been. It has, in a very real sense, always been the same underlying hunger. And the grocery store itself, across every single one of its many changes over the decades, has always seemed to understand that basic truth on some level, and has consistently built itself, again and again, accordingly. So here we are together at the very end of this long walk. You have made your way through the entire journey now, from the chrome-wheeled shopping carts of 1955, all the way to a self-checkout machine quietly, mechanically accusing you of having attempted to steal a single cucumber. From a woman in heels carefully selecting her gelatin mold with the evident seriousness of someone making a genuinely important decision, because, within the terms of her own particular world, she genuinely was, all the way to a person standing in pajama pants at 10 o'clock on an ordinary Tuesday evening, holding a rotisserie chicken and a bag of something they will very likely finish eating entirely before they even make it back to their car. You have watched the frozen television dinner make its quiet, permanent arrival, just as the formal, mandatory family meal gradually and quietly stepped back. You have seen oat bran rise rapidly to genuine national prominence, and then fall away again with roughly the speed of a passing minor celebrity trend. You have witnessed an entire country decide, within the span of just a few short years, that gluten had suddenly become the central problem, and then, just as quickly, largely move on to worrying about something else entirely. You have stood, in your imagination at least, inside the warehouse store at the exact moment when a 48-pack of granola bars somehow makes complete, obvious sense to buy. And you have stood in front of the yogurt case for what felt like a genuinely long while, quietly wondering whether unlimited freedom of choice was ever really quite everything it had originally been promised to be. It sounds fairly funny, laid out all together like this, and a great deal of it genuinely is. But underneath all of the fondue sets and the fat-free cookies and the crowded kombucha shelf and the self-checkout machine's small blinking yellow light of quiet mechanical judgment, there is something else present as well, something that is not remotely funny at all. There is the woman who cooked a full dinner nearly every single night for 30 consecutive years, without anyone around her ever really pausing to ask whether she genuinely enjoyed doing it. There is the family that regularly ate frozen dinners, not because they considered themselves especially modern or forward-thinking, but simply because, on most given evenings, they were genuinely, deeply tired. There is the child whose school lunch consisted of a prepackaged lunch kit, not out of any particular preference, but simply because nobody in the household had found the time that particular morning to prepare anything else. And there is the farmer setting up at the Saturday morning market, having risen well before dawn, so that some stranger could later hand them a few dollars for a single tomato and walk away feeling genuinely good about that small transaction. There is the warehouse worker and the delivery driver and the person quietly restocking shelves late at night, and the cashier standing at the register who has, by this point, heard the self-checkout machine announce an unexpected item in the bagging area something close to 9,000 separate times over the course of their career, and has nonetheless kept showing up for their shift anyway, day after day. Food, in the end, is never simply food on its own. It is time, and it is real physical labor, and it is love in its own quiet way, and it is genuine anxiety, and it is memory, and it is the specific, particular smell of some grocery store your own mother once regularly took you to as a child, one you would still instantly recognize even now, even after many years have passed, even here, tonight, in the dark. It is the casserole someone once made for you the week you happened to be sick. It is the cereal you once ate standing quietly over the kitchen sink on the particular morning, when everything else in your life seemed to be falling apart all at once. It is the loaf of bread you personally baked at some point during a long, uncertain pandemic, mainly because you needed something concrete to occupy your hands and quiet your own fear for a while, and it rose imperfectly, slightly lopsided, and you ate it anyway while it was still warm, and it was, in that particular moment, genuinely enough. America's long relationship with its own grocery store has been, across all these decades, strange in places, deeply commercial throughout, and on more than a few occasions, genuinely misguided in its underlying approach. It has also been, when you step back and look at the full shape of it, something close to a full century-long attempt to seriously answer the single oldest question that any household anywhere has ever had to face, fresh, every single day without exception. How exactly do we manage to feed ourselves? And beyond that basic question, how do we manage to make that ordinary daily act genuinely mean something more than mere survival? The specific answers to both of those questions have clearly changed considerably over time, and they will, in all likelihood, continue quietly changing well into the future. The store itself will inevitably reorganize itself once again at some point. Something entirely new will eventually appear on the shelf in the beverage aisle. Someone, somewhere, will eventually invent an entirely new kind of snack carrying a name that does not currently exist. The self-checkout lanes will likely be removed in some locations, and then, quite possibly, reinstalled again somewhere else down the line. This particular cycle will simply continue because the underlying hunger driving all of it, not merely for food itself, but for genuine ease, for real abundance, and for the quiet, steady reassurance that the coming week is broadly manageable and that dinner will, somehow, reliably happen, does not ever fully go away on its own. So tonight, as you settle in wherever you happen to be right now, your own clean bed, your own warm room, your own house with its refrigerator humming quietly away somewhere in the kitchen, filled with things you yourself chose to bring home, perhaps take just one small, quiet moment. For the woman in heels who once knew every single aisle of her local store completely by heart. For the tired parent who reached for the can opener simply because that was genuinely what there was time for that particular evening. And for the farmers, and the delivery drivers, and the overnight shelf stockers and the bakers, and every single person standing somewhere along that very long chain stretching from the soil all the way to your own table, who together made it quietly possible for you to eat today without having to think especially hard about any of it. They fed you. Generation after generation, in whatever particular form the grocery store happened to be taking at that specific moment in time, somebody, somewhere along that chain, fed you. That is genuinely worth something. It might very well be worth everything. Sleep well.